Fourth Fight. Sweet and Sour Book 4. Written by Flynn. 1. The letter came in a bright green envelope. It was a usual spring day in this strange little town I now called home. Children scampered past me on the way to school. Birds flew overhead, new arrivals returning from the south. A truck drove past me driven by a man-bear. The neighbor down the street was mowing their newly greened lawn by chewing on it as all the goat people did. I plucked the envelope from the mailbox out front of the house and eyed the strange colored container with suspicion. The letter was addressed to both Orion and me. I walked back inside the house with the bills in one hand and the envelope in the other. "Do any leprechauns live in this place?" I asked Orion as I walked into the kitchen. He stood at the stove, firing up a heaping helping of bacon. He shook his head without turning around. "No. Just witches." "Why?" I held up the envelope. "Because we got this." He glanced over his shoulder and smiled. "Open it." I frowned. "Why don't you open it?" "Because you'll like what's in it." I sniffed the envelope. "It's not non-scent meat, is it?" "Open it and see." I sighed and tore open the top. "All right, but this better not be a joke." Inside the envelope was not a werewolf treat, but a letter printed on white paper. I read aloud the notice. Orion and Trixie. You are cordially invited to the blessing of the tree for Genevieve Capra. I lowered the letter into my lap and frowned. Who's Genevieve Capra? The daughter of the goat down the street. Oh right. When's the blessing? I wrinkled my nose. Is this such a good thing for a kid to go through? She's 15. Yeah, but do you remember what happened to us after I went through mine? I mean, this isn't going to be some erotic show, is it? And how come she didn't just wander up there like I did and take a bite? Why the ceremony? He turned around with a pan full of finished bacon and smiled. Always the reporter, aren't you? I folded my arms across my chest and tapped my foot on the floor. That doesn't answer any of my questions. He scratched the back of his head and sighed. To be honest, I don't know why your blessing was so different. Maybe it was because you weren't from around here. He glanced over his shoulder and gave me a wink. What I do know is you were slightly older than the average person who bites into an apple, and our little romp happened because there was a full moon. I glared at him. I was just a later bloomer, that's all. It's not my fault I wasn't born in this town. He piled the bacon onto 2 plates, and slid one in front of me with a wink. I think you're catching up pretty well. I picked up a piece and tore off half of it. Bits flew out as I spoke. I'd be going faster if we didn't have to solve all these problems. Orion took a seat beside me, and took the notice from my hand. It says here the blessing's tomorrow. No wonder goats out there mowing the lawn this early in the season. I swallowed my bacon. So, what happens at a normal blessing? A sly smile slipped onto his lips, as he tucked the letter back into the envelope. I think I'll save that as a surprise. I rolled my eyes. This isn't some birthday party where the guests don't know the presents and the birthday girl does. You're still going to have to wait. I slumped my shoulders and took a hefty bite of bacon. You're going to be the death of me, you know that, don't you? He leaned forward and pecked a kiss on my lips. I expect it. A mating's for life. My cheeks betrayed me with a blush that I shook off. I turned away and chewed on my food. Well, at least promise me the blessing won't be too surprising. He held up his hand. I solemnly swear it won't be too surprising. You were never in the Boy Scouts, were you? Nope. Notwithstanding the not too honest swearing from the not scout, I went to the blessing feeling like the odd man out. A flood of people walked the short trip up the road, and onto the wide path that led to the tree, and I suspected all of them knew what to expect during this ceremony. The fresh spring leaves of the trees waved in a breeze as we trudged through the woods. The flow of shifters arrived at the meadow, in which stood the evergreen apple tree. A dozen rows of chairs, 10 chairs deep, with an aisle between the rows, stood before the small mound that harbored the sacred plant. Amul, the sentinel bear of the tree, welcomed everyone with a smile as he stood off to one side at the rear of the chairs. The corners of his lips looked a little tense though. I paused at the opening to the meadow, and furrowed my brow. The thick, luscious leaves of the tree looked a little off, like they didn't have the fine luster of healthy life. I wrinkled my nose as a rotten odor passed over my nostrils. Orion nudged me.
"Something wrong?" he whispered.
I shook myself and shrugged.
"Probably just a trick of the light."
"You wrinkled your nose," he wondered. I rubbed the bottom of my nose and shrugged.
"Probably all this rotting vegetation."
"It's my first spring as a werewolf, so I'm probably not used to it." We grabbed a pair of seats at the back, and close to the aisle. I watched the other guests come in. One of them was the motel's proprietor, Troy. I nudged Orion with my elbow, and nodded at the old guest.
"Does he show up to all of these things?"
Orion followed my gaze and frowned. He shook his head. "No. I've never seen him away from his motel." A flutist struck up a haunting tune. The remaining guests took a seat, and the murmurs stopped. Everyone turned in their seats and looked at the rear. I followed their gaze and watched as a man of 40 stepped out of the trees. By his side was a young girl of 16. Their arms were looped together like that of a father and bride. They walked down the aisle together, in time with the slow melody. The father smiled and bowed his head at the guests. The girl's smile wavered, and her eyes were fixed on the tree. They walked up the small hill, where they faced one another before the large trunk. The man smiled down at his daughter and squeezed her hands. "My little Genevieve, it gives me great pleasure to bring you here to the tree for your blessing day." He looked up at the tree, and swept his hand over the plant.
"Now choose your apple.
Be who you were meant to be." Genevieve let go of his hand, and turned to face the tree. Her eyes zeroed in on one particular apple, that hung from a low branch. She walked over and raised her hand. The apple glowed a little, and dropped itself from its branch and into her hand. She smiled as she turned the fruit over in her palms. There was a faraway look in her eyes, as she tilted her head to one side, and examined the apple. Genevieve lifted the apple to her lips, and took a big bite. She closed her eyes and dropped her arms to her side. Her body glowed like the apple. The light was so bright that I blinked against its brilliance. The light gave off a pulse. Genevieve's eyes flew open. She opened her mouth in a soundless scream, as the light around her flickered. Patches of fur burst from her flesh, and her face became distorted as a gray-colored snout elongated her nose but left her mouth in place. The young girl collapsed amid the cries of her parents. Her father caught her before she hit the ground, and cradled her in his arms as his wife rushed to his side. Several of the audience members hurried over. A beautiful young woman stood from the chair in the far left corner. She had long blonde, sun-colored hair that hung to her waist, and eyes as bright green as the apples on the tree. Her attire was a simple loose blouse with bell-shaped cuffs and blue jeans. The woman walked up the few steps to the crowd. Those in the rear noticed her and parted. She strode through the crowd and to the young girl and her distraught parents. The mother looked up at her. Her cheeks were streaked with tears.
"Please help her.
Please." The young woman smiled down at her. The mother slipped out of the way, and the stranger knelt by the young girl's side. Genevieve's transformation had paused before the finish, so she was stuck halfway between human and a goat. Short stubby horns stuck out of her forehead, and her wide eyes showed that her pupils were rectangular. Her father cradled her in his lap, but looked up at the young woman. His lips quivered. "See, can you help her?" The woman looked down at Genevieve, and her face fell as she studied the pitiful state of the young girl. She lay her palm on the young girl's forehead. Genevieve gasped and arched her back. Her mouth widened and her body trembled. The fur and horns slipped back into her body. Her eyes returned to those of a human. She let out a garbled scream that had hints of a bleating sound. Her father held her tight against him. "Genevieve! Genevieve!" Genevieve gasped and her eyes rolled back in her head. She fell back into her father's arms, and her head lolled to one side. Her father's eyes widened, and he whipped his head up to the young woman. She was smiling as she watched over Genevieve.
"What's wrong with her?"
The woman stroked Genevieve's forehead. "She will sleep for a while, but when she awakes she will be her human self." Her father started back.
Not her shifter self."
The young woman raised her eyes to his and shook her head. "No. I have halted her change, at least for the moment."
"What's wrong with her?" he asked her.
Genevieve's mother grasped the woman's arm.
"Will she be okay?"
The young woman patted her on the hand and smiled at her.
"There is no need to worry."
She glanced over her shoulder and her eyes met my gaze. It was like looking into a bottomless pool of water that captured my every attention. The tree will guide her to her true calling very soon. 2. Armel stepped up to the crowd and raised his thick arms above his head. "The ceremony is over. Please return to your homes." The crowd reluctantly turned away from the family, and Armel herded them down the aisle. Orion stood behind me, and we were both trapped between two rows of chairs. I took one step into the flow of people, but Armel grabbed my shoulder and pulled me back into the row. "You two stay here," he commanded before he strode past us with the other audience members before him. I glanced over my shoulder at Orion. "So I'm guessing this isn't how things are supposed to go." He shook his head. "No. The girl was supposed to change completely into a shifter."
"Has this happened before?"
"No, at least not during the ceremony." I raised an eyebrow.
"Then when?"
"Do you remember Jerry's daughter? The girl with the stripes on her cheeks?" he asked me. I snorted.
"How could I forget a tiger girl?"
She tried to transform into her shifter self shortly after her ceremony, and was trapped halfway between forms.
"That's what's usually happened in the past."
He looked past me at the girl on the ground.
"This is far worse." "I think getting caught in between isn't all that great," I countered.
He pursed his lips. "This shows that the problem is with the tree, and not with the kids who have gotten stuck in between." I returned my attention to the small group at the base of the tree.
"So who's the woman?" "Her name is Sage, the guide of the tree," he told me.
I turned to him and raised an eyebrow. "The what?"
"The guide," he repeated.
"Think of her as a nurse to the first bite ceremony. She's there in case someone doesn't eat enough apple or eats too much."
"So what does she do when those things happen?"
I asked him. "I guide them to the right balance." I spun around and yelped. The woman stood just behind me, with a smile on her lips. She'd been kneeling beneath the tree several yards away only a second before. Sage tilted her head to one side and studied me with that peculiar lopsided smile.
"I don't believe we've met, Miss Lyle."
"My name is Sage." I folded my arms over my chest and frowned. "Have you ever thought about changing your name to Sneak?" She chuckled. "Most who know me wouldn't dare suggest I do anything."
"Well, call me Special," I quipped.
"We do," a voice spoke up. Troy came up behind her and he too had that same strange smile. "That is why we need your help." "Help with what?" I asked him. Troy looked past me. I turned and watched Armel stride past us and up the aisle. He climbed the steps and lifted the unconscious Genevieve into his arms. Her distraught parents followed close behind as he led them out of the meadow. That left Orion and me with Sage and Troy. I cast a side glance at the pair and arched an eyebrow. "Help with this? How?" Sage's face fell and she bowed her head. She clasped her hands together in front of her and slowly opened them. In her palms was a yellowed leaf. I frowned and glanced up at the apple tree. The pure green canopy was now speckled with the yellowed leaves. So the tree has yellow leaves. What's the big deal? I asked her. Orion pursed his lips as he studied the leaf. The leaves on the tree have never changed color nor dropped. Maybe you guys need a fertilizer, not me, I returned. Sage tipped the leaf into one palm and stretched her hand out to me.
Touch it.
I frowned.
I don't want to touch it.
Touch it, and you will understand the problem we present to you, she told me. I looked up at Orion and arched an eyebrow. Seriously? Touching a leaf? He shrugged.
What harm could it do?
I sighed and turned back to the woman and her leaf.
All right, here goes.
I took the leaf. The moment my fingers wrapped around its crinkly surface, a terrible pain stabbed into me. Needles stabbed every part of my body and my stomach did flip-flops. My shaking knees collapsed beneath me and I dropped to the ground. I leaned over and exercised my lunch onto the ground. Orion grabbed my shoulders. It felt like his hands were a vice slowly squeezing my bones out of my skin. Let go. I shrieked. He jerked his hands back. Sage knelt in front of me and set her hand on my clenched fist. A soothing warmth slipped into my trembling fingers and up into the rest of my body. I took a deep, shuddering breath as she opened my hand and took the leaf. The pain vanished the moment the leaf ceased to touch me. I looked up into her sorrowful eyes and searched them for answers.
What was that? The pain of the tree, she told me.
She looked past me at Orion. You may touch her now. Orion helped me to my shaky feet, and I leaned against his shoulder as I watched Sage stand and tuck the leaf into her pocket.
Why is it in that much pain?
She pursed her lips and glanced at the great tree. I believe someone has poisoned it with black magic. Orion frowned. Are you sure this wasn't an accident? Or maybe a mistake? She shook her head. No. The signs have been there for quite some time, so whoever has done this has poisoned the tree over many months. The kid's half transforming. I guessed. Sage nodded.
Yes.
And you want us to find out who it is before someone else gets hurt? I added. She smiled and bowed her head.
We do.
We? I glanced to my left where Troy slipped into my view. I arched an eyebrow.
So you're in on this too?
I am, he acknowledged. I glanced between the pair.
So, how many people know about this poisoning?
Only Troy, Armel, the librarian and myself, Sage told me. Orion glanced at the entrance to the meadow. And after today, the rest of the town is going to know something's wrong. I folded my arms across my chest and frowned.
So why do you think we're good for this job?
And why didn't you tell the police sooner? You might have caught the guy by now, instead of waiting for us. We waited for you, Troy corrected me. I arched an eyebrow. Why me? Sage glanced over her shoulder at the ancient overgrown bush. We did not know the severity of the problem until the tree brought you here. That was the sign that assistance outside of our community was needed. She turned to me and met my gaze. You were needed. I held up my hands.
Wait a sec.
You're trying to tell me the tree brought me here, turned me into a werewolf, and had me go through a bunch of mysteries just so I could solve its apple problem? Sage smiled. Fate is strange, is it not? I ran a hand through my hair and pursed my lips. I wouldn't use those words, but saving a tree? I know it's alive, but it's not alive. You felt its pain, Sage pointed out.
Yeah, but come on.
Me? I'm just a reporter. I glanced at Orion. Help me out here. He shrugged. I don't know. My face fell. Some help you are. I muttered, as I returned my attention to the two expectant people in front of me.
So what exactly do you want me to do?
Find the source of the poison and stop it, Sage told me. If you guys haven't figured that, how can I? I pointed out. Troy chuckled. You have a way of finding trouble. And trouble makes headlines, a voice spoke up. Orion and I glanced over our shoulders as Troy and Sage looked behind us. A woman of 30 with a long red felt overcoat walked toward us. She wore a white blouse and a short red skirt beneath the coat, and in her feet were a pair of black flat-foot shoes. Over one shoulder was a leather strap for a large leather bag. In her hand was her smartphone that she held like a voice recorder. Armel hurried up behind her and slipped in front of her, blocking her path. You were told to leave. The woman put her hands on her hips and glared at him. And let the first interesting story about the tree go unreported? Not on my watch.
It's all right, Armel.
Let her through, Sage told him. The woman gave him a wink before she slipped past him and over to us. There was a sly smile on her face as she stopped between our pairs and looked from one side to the other. My, doesn't this look interesting? The town elders gathered around the tree with the newest addition to the community. She shoved the phone in my face.
That makes me wonder if any of you can comment on the recent bungle by the tree.
I pushed the phone away. Who the heck are you? She drew the voice recording machine back and glared at me. Careful with the phone, Wolfie. It's not easy or cheap getting the UPS to deliver all the way out here. Sage looked to me but gestured to the woman.
This is
Loretta Hopper, the woman interrupted as she held up her hand for me to shake. And you must be the famous Trixie Lyle. I ignored her hand.
Should I know you?
The smile faltered a little as she drew her hand back. No, my beat doesn't follow you, or it didn't until the tree decided to wig out and nearly kill a kid. The young girl was never in any danger of dying, Sage assured her.
But can you say for sure that it won't happen next time?
Hopper countered.
There will not be a next time, Sage insisted.
Hopper's eyes flickered to me.
So you have someone on the case?
Someone other than the police? I cannot comment at this time, she replied. Hopper held the phone close to Sage's face. But as a town leader and the caretaker of the tree, can you guess as to what happened here? Sage shook her head. No, but I can assure you and your readers that the problem will soon be found and repaired. Hopper drew the phone against her own lips. Do you mean to tell me that even after all this time, all these months of kids getting stuck in between, you still don't know what the problem is? If you will excuse me, I must speak with Armel. Sage brushed past her and walked over to the burly man who now stood at the entrance to the meadow. Together, the pair left the area. You can't run from the press forever, Hopper shouted as they disappeared down the path. She turned back to us and smiled.
Does anyone else care to make a comment? I still didn't catch why you're asking these questions, I pointed out.
I work for the Daily Brew, and writing about the tree is the job I'm stuck with, she told me. She held the phone to my face. As a fellow reporter, why not give me a break and a comment for my story? I pushed the phone away. As a fellow reporter, I can tell you you're barking up the wrong tree. I don't know what happened here.
But you're going to find out.
That's why you were brought here by the tree, wasn't it? She persisted. I got brought here by bad luck and a god with a sick sense of humor, I retorted. Her eyes flickered to Troy. Any chance I can get a word from you, Troy? He smiled and leaned forward over the microphone. No comment. Hopper pulled her phone away and pocketed it as she glared at him. You're a big help as always, Troy. He bowed his head. I am always glad to help. She frowned as she adjusted her bag. I'd get a better comment by the wind rustling through the leaves of the tree. She spun around and stomped off down the path. The humor fled from Troy as he turned to us. Come to the library after nightfall. We have much more to discuss.
First we'd have to agree to the job, I pointed out.
He gestured to the tree. Would you have what happened to Genevieve befall another? I glanced at the spot on the ground where Genevieve had fallen and pursed my lips. Fine. We'll be there, but I expect answers. He smiled and bowed his head. We will give what we can. 3. At nightfall, Orion and I found ourselves standing at the bottom of the steps in front of the library. At our backs and a couple blocks down was the lively main street of the town. Around us was the deserted parking lot. In front of us was the darkened windows of the imperious fortress of knowledge. Think this is a good idea? I asked Orion, who stood at my side.
It might not be easy finding out who did this, he admitted.
I glanced up at him and arched an eyebrow. Is the list of suspects that long? He shook his head.
No, short.
No one has a motive. No one's got a grudge against being turned into a hedgehog or a chicken? I asked him. He smiled.
Not that I know of, but there were some squawks from the unlucky chickens.
I jerked my head at the library. What about the 4 waiting for us inside? He met my gaze and arched an eyebrow. 4. I held up my hand and counted up using 4 fingers. Troy Sage, the librarian, a guy who doesn't even have a name, and now this Sage woman. Does anyone know what their motives are, or even what they are? The humor slipped from his face as he shook his head.
That's a story even Hopper hasn't been able to find out, and her family has been reporting on the area for over a century.
I blinked at him.
So the group's all been around for that long?
Yes. And nobody's been able to find out about them?
Not so far.
He looked up at the dark building and pursed his lips. I did try to find out more from Troy, but his reply was always, maybe later. And the others? I persisted. He shrugged. Sage is hard to find outside of the tree ceremonies. You yourself know how secretive Mab is, and the librarian always pointed to the forbidden section of the library whenever anyone asked him anything. His eyes flickered back down to me.
But why the worry now?
I don't think they're going to kick you out, after you and I saved the town 3 times already. I looked down at my hand that had held the shockingly painful leaf, and shook my head. I don't know, but this mess with the tree is making my reporter senses tingle, and not in a good way. A light flickered on inside the main part of the library, and in a moment one of the front doors opened. The librarian, that ancient grave-looking man, stepped out and looked down at us from beneath his bushy eyebrows. You are late. Our sundials were a little off, I quipped as I grabbed Orion's hand and dragged him up the stairs. The librarian stepped aside and let us pass. Our footsteps echoed on the hard floors as we took a few steps inside. The librarian shut the door behind us, and a shiver ran through me as I heard him lock the door. He shuffled past us and around the front desk, to a wood door with foggy glass. On the glass was written, "Reserved Room." The librarian opened the door, and turned to us as he gestured to the interior. This way. I led Orion into the small room that lay beyond the door. The walls and ceiling were made of thick planks of ancient weathered wood, and was without windows or any other entrance. A heavy wood table sat in the middle, and was surrounded by 10 chairs. 3 of them were occupied, and by the very people I was counting off outside. Troy stood as we entered and smiled at us. On his left sat Sage at the end of the table opposite the door, and on her left was Mab. Troy walked down the table, and drew out the chair at the other end as he looked to me. It is good to see you, Miss Lyle. I arched an eyebrow, but slipped into the offered seat.
I'm not so sure it's good to be here, I returned as I heard the librarian lock the door behind us.
Orion took a seat on my right while Troy resumed his. The librarian took the chair beside Troy. Sage clasped her hands together atop the table, and smiled at me. We called you here in order to have more private surroundings, so we may be frank with you. As Troy and I informed you at the tree, we believe you were sent here in order to rescue it from its poisoning. I held up my hand. I'd hate to agree with a rival reporter, but Hopper had a point when she wondered why you guys haven't figured it out after, well, however long it's been poisoned. What do you think I'm going to do that you haven't? We have faith in the tree's choice, and so we have faith in you to see what we cannot see, she told me. I leaned back and pursed my lips.
That's a little vague.
Besides, if the tree's so lively, then isn't there some way you can ask it what happened? Sage shook her head. That is impossible. While the tree is a sentient creature, it only communicates through emotions. So you guys don't even know when it might have been poisoned? I asked them. Probably a year from last winter, Mab spoke up. Armel's a werebear, so he has to sleep a couple of days out of the week. And who knows that Armel hibernates? I wondered. Mab shrugged. Everyone in town. Any hints on the poison? I persisted. Sage stuck her hand in her pants pocket and drew out the yellowed leaf. We believe this contains some of the poison, but the priestess will be able to confirm that. Orion sat up and arched an eyebrow. You want us to go into the swamps? There is no one who knows poison better than she, Sage pointed out. I raised my hand. What swamps and exactly what is she a priestess of? Orion turned to me. The Mortel swamps are located past the old cemetery. The priestess is the de facto ruler of the grounds mostly because nobody wants to live near there, and a practitioner of the ancient voodoo arts. Voodoo? I repeated. Orion nodded. I glanced at Mab.
So how come you don't visit her?
You're both well witches. She pursed her lips and shook her head.
We don't get along.
I sighed. Of course not. We believe you will have better luck with speaking to her, Sage encouraged me before she leaned down and blew softly on the leaf. The leaf floated across the table and landed neatly in front of me. I pointed at the yellow object. It isn't going to hurt if I touch it, right? She smiled and shook her head. I stretched out my hand and gave the leaf a tiny tap with the end of a finger. The leaf merely rocked back and forth. I took the leaf and tucked it into my coat pocket before I returned my attention to the imperious 4. So anything else you can tell us besides it happened almost a year and a half ago, and poison might be involved? Sage shook her head. That is all we know. I sighed and rose from my seat.
That isn't much to go on, but I guess we'd better get started.
You have other questions, Troy spoke up. All eyes fell on him. The librarian arched an eyebrow as he studied his stoic friend.
What questions?
Troy leaned back in his seat and smiled at me. You wish to know what parts we play in this town, don't you? I shrugged.
Yeah, but I heard you were as tight-lipped as a tomb.
Would it give you incentive, his eyes flickered to Orion, both of you, if we were to promise to tell you our secrets if you solve this one last mystery for the town? Mab's mouth dropped open. The librarian leaned on the table and glared at Troy.
That is not an acceptable exchange.
The threat we face is far greater than any we have met, and that is why we must place all our cards on the table, Troy finished for him. As caretakers of the valley, we must do all within our power, and at nearly any price. Sage smiled and raised her hand. I second Troy's motion. Mab crossed her arms and frowned.
All right, I'll third it.
Sage's eyes fell on the librarian. It would be best if this were passed unanimously. The librarian leaned back and pursed his lips. Fine, but this must be done with as great a discretion as possible. If the citizens were to find out, then there would be panic. Sage nodded.
Yes, the leaf shows you are correct.
As they continued to talk about the fate of an overgrown fern, something caught my attention. I tilted my head to one side and furrowed my brow. My werewolf hearing picked up on an annoying ticking sound just outside the room. I glanced at my watch. Does this library have a clock that starts ticking at 13 minutes past the hour? The librarian frowned.
There is no clock inside this library.
Orion's eyes widened, and he leapt to his feet. Everyone outside. The librarian glared at him.
There is no shouting in the library.
Orion grabbed his arm and that of Troy, and pulled them out of their seats. Out. You heard the hunter. I shouted as I grabbed Mab and Sage's arms. We rushed out of the room and into the lobby. The ticking was louder there, so loud it echoed up and down the aisles between the bookshelves. Our group sprinted past the towering stacks and out into the cool night air. Orion was the last one out with me just in front of him. My foot touched the top step when an explosion rocked the ground beneath me. I yelped and tumbled forward as broken glass peppered the back of my body. Orion wrapped his arm around me and tucked me under his arm as he leapt down the stairs and landed with a neat landing onto the sidewalk. The 4 town leaders stood in front of us, facing the explosion. The librarian's mouth was agape as he stumbled forward.
Not the library.
Orion set me down, and we both turned toward the library. All the windows were broken, and where the front doors had been was now a large hole. Fires burned along the remains of the front wall. Tattered pages of books floated down and covered the blackened marble steps. In the distance came the wail of fire sirens. I looked up at Orion's tense face. For once I wish my reporter senses were wrong. 4. Is everyone all right? Sage spoke up. Mab glanced at the librarian and pursed her lips. In body yes, but not in mind. The man was a gaping statue, his eyes wide and his knees trembling. His legs buckled, and he slid onto his knees with his arms hanging by his sides.
That's not the library, he murmured.
Sage knelt beside him and set her hands on his shoulders.
It shall be rebuilt and the knowledge restored.
He turned to face her and shook his head.
This cannot be tolerated.
And it will not, and I am sure our friends here, she gestured to Orion and me, shall find whoever has done this sacrilegious act. The librarian balled his hands into fists and frowned as he climbed to his feet. He whipped his head to us and narrowed his eyes. Whatever information you need, I will be at your complete disposal. Your offer will have to wait, Troy spoke up as he nodded toward the center of town.
We have company.
We glimpsed the flashing lights of police cars as they sped between the buildings of Main Street and toward the library. Mab looked to Sage and jerked her head toward the park. I think we should leave before people get the wrong idea about all of us being here. Sage nodded.
Yes, that would be awkward.
She glanced at me and smiled. Good luck. We are all counting on you. I winced as the 2 women turned away and walked into the darkness.
No pressure,
I muttered as the first police car turned onto the street. My eyes flickered to Orion.
This town wouldn't happen to have a bomb expert, would it?
He shook his head.
Nope.
We haven't had anything larger than a tractor engine explode. I arched an eyebrow.
How'd that happen?
He sheepishly grinned and rubbed the back of his head. Would you believe my friends and I were trying to fix it? I snorted.
Yes, I would.
The police car pulled up and out jumped Chief Bill Orso and one of his men. 3 other vehicles pulled up behind them, and soon we had 8 burly bears. The chief turned to his men and pointed at the library. Help get those fires out until the truck comes. The officers pulled fire extinguishers from their trunks and hurried to the library. Orso returned his attention to us and studied each of our group. Well, what happened? Someone planted a bomb in the library, Orion told him. Orso arched an eyebrow. Are you kidding me? I gestured to the burning building.
Does that answer your question?
The chief pursed his lips.
All right, you're not kidding.
Did you get a good look or sniff of the perpetrator? Orion shook his head. No. We were in the reserved room talking. About what? The chief wondered. About a job I might have for them, Troy spoke up. The chief pursed his lips as his eyes flickered over our small group.
This job wouldn't happen to be about that trouble at the tree, would it?
Troy chuckled.
Nothing so dramatic.
I merely needed them to go on an errand for me.
What errand? The chief persisted.
Troy winced and bent down to rub his knee. I'm nearly out of my therapeutic bath salts, and I need these nice young people to fetch them from Madame Corvus. Also arched both eyebrows.
The priestess?
I thought she only dabbled in poisons. And bath salts, Troy added. Also shook his head, before he turned his attention to the librarian.
I suppose I don't need to ask why you were at the library this late.
No. The chief sighed and lifted his hat to run a hand through his hat hair.
What the heck's going on here?
First that ceremony and now this. The next thing you know, I'll be neck-deep into reporters. Orion nodded at an ancient grey Buick that flew down the road from the main street. Here it comes, and in triplicate. The vehicle held 3 people, 2 in the front and 1 in the back. Hopper was in the back seat, but the first to get out after the car came to a stop just behind the police cars. The other passenger was a middle-aged woman with permed graying hair and an outfit that could be heard across town. A large yellow summer hat covered her head and nearly slipped off as it brushed the top of the car door as she got out. Her matching yellow dress pants and light coat with a white shirt completed the loud attire. The driver was an ancient hag, bent with countless decades of age, and her face heavy with thick black glasses with a string of beads connected to them that looped around the back of her neck. She wore a flowered print dress and black flat shoes. Chief also put his hat back on and shook his head.
Just what I need.
The witch, the lion, and the wardrobe. I raised an eyebrow.
I think you've got that a little mixed up.
Also shook his head.
Nope.
It's the perfect name for those carrions. All 3 of the women looked as hungry as a starved bird, and they all had the same nostrils that flared at the scent of a good story, as they hurried through the crowds and flashing cars to the police tape. The older women had more speed than their features showed, and only the burly presence of one of the bear officers stopped them from speeding under the line and into the blast area.
I'm sorry, ma'ams, but you can't come in here.
It's too dangerous, he warned them. The oldest woman wagged her finger at him. You can't block the press forever, young man, so you may as well step aside and let us through. You should know that, Officer Danny, the middle-aged woman chimed in. I'd hate to think one of my brightest cub reporters didn't learn the importance of the press. I leaned toward Orion and lowered my voice. Is it just me, or are those 3 related? They are, he confirmed as he nodded at each of the older women. The older woman is her mother, Luella Hopper, and the woman in the dress is her grandmother, Myrtle Parsons. She owns the Daily Brew. So the lion is Hopper, the wardrobe is her mom, and the witch is her grandma. I guessed.
Yep.
A thought hit me that made me furrow my brow. Do they live around here? I mean close by. He shook his head. No. Loretta's apartment is across town, and her mother and grandmother live in a small farmhouse just outside of town. I rubbed my chin between my fingers.
So how come they're already here?
Orion's eyes flickered down to me and he smiled. Your reporter senses tingling again? I folded my arms across my chest and studied the trio as they wrangled with the law. All I'm saying is the clown car got here fast, and Hopper might have overheard Troy telling us to meet him here tonight.
Her hearing is excellent, but I doubt she overheard our plans from so far away.
Besides, they're leaders in building the community, not blowing it up. It wouldn't be the first time a fine, upstanding member of the community's tried to kill us. Remember the crazed druggist? I reminded him. He smiled and shook his head. Loretta wouldn't risk upsetting her mother and grandmother. They are rather imposing. The pair were imposing their way on the police officer, as Myrtle reached up and wagged her bony finger in his face. Now you listen here, young man. As a cub reporter, you should let us through this instant.
What's this cub reporter stuff about?
I asked Orion. The Daily Brew hires 4 students a year from the 9th grade to help with the articles, Orion explained. I glanced back at the hag-like oldest woman and shuddered. I would have passed on working for the crypt keeper. Chief also pursed his lips and grabbed his belt to hitch up his pants. Some days I hate this job. His eyes flickered to Orion. You wouldn't happen to want to be deputized right now, would you? Orion smiled and shook his head.
Not on your life.
The chief sighed. Didn't think so. Here goes. Also marched up to the line of police that encircled the library, as the call of a fire engine siren blared across town. In another second the machine came into view, and sped up to the curb where the men leapt out. The police let them through, and the women tried to follow, but also barred their path. He smiled at them and gave a small bow of his head. Good evening, ladies. What can I do for you? You can stop interfering with the press, Myrtle snapped at him. He shook his head. I'm sorry, Mrs. Parsons, but right now the job of the firemen is a little more important than yours. The old woman straightened to her full 5-foot height, and puffed out her chest like a ruffled bird. There is no greater job than that of the newspaper. Who would tell the truth? Who would? Write that off as a speech when it sounds more like an editorial, I quipped. Myrtle whipped her head to me and pursed her wrinkled lips together. You needn't turn your nose up at us, Miss Lyle. We may be a small-town newspaper, but those are the heart and feet of the town, I added as I glanced at Hopper. You have to be since you got here so fast. She smiled and shrugged. We were working at the shop, preparing for tomorrow's run of the paper, when we heard the news over the scanner. I guess we'll have to update it. And that is why you must answer our questions, Chief Orso. Myrtle insisted, as she punctuated every word with a finger against his suited chest.
What Grandma is trying to tell you is that we'd like an interview with you, Hopper spoke up as she drew out her cell phone with its built-in microphone.
She shoved the speaker into Orso's face. Any word on what caused this terrible explosion? He pushed the cell phone away from him and shook his head.
Sorry, ladies, but I can't comment on something I don't know.
Then you don't know what happened? Hopper wondered. Orso pursed his lips.
What I meant to say is,
was anybody hurt in the fire? Her mother spoke up. The chief shook his head.
No, but
Hopper's eyes flickered over to Orion and me, and a sly smile slipped onto her lips. Who was in the building at the time? I can't answer.
Were there any witnesses?
Any suspects? Orso held up his hands and shook his head.
I really can't help you, ladies.
I frowned, and leaned toward Orion so he could hear my whispering voice. I think we need to save him, before he starts jackhammering his way deeper. Orion strode forward, and put his hand on Orso's shoulder. The police chief whipped his head back, and his tense expression softened as Orion grinned at him. We should give these ladies a proper interview, in the proper setting, shouldn't we? Orso smiled. We should, shouldn't we? He returned his attention to the 3 women, as they looked suspiciously between the men. The chief gestured to his patrol car. Please step this way, and I will give you my undivided attention. The women glanced at each other, before Myrtle lifted her peaked nose in the air. Very well, Chief Orso, if you insist. She turned and walked toward the car, with the other 2 following. Orso gave Orion a wink, before he strode after them. Orion rejoined me, as I raised my eyebrow.
What was that about?
He leaned down and lowered his voice.
You'll see.
A slammed car door and muffled shrieking voices grabbed my attention. I whipped my head back in the direction of the police car, and glimpsed the 2 angry faces of Myrtle and her granddaughter, Hopper, in the back window of the cruiser. Luella glared out the other window, and pounded her fist on the glass. Orso was just stepping out of the front passenger seat, while 2 of his men stood at each rear door with grins on their faces. My eyes flickered to Orion, as he chuckled.
What just happened?
An old trick I taught Orso. It's called Prisoner's Dilemma, he told me. You need a few simple ingredients. The victims, he nodded at the women in the back seat, a police car and their eager ears. Get them to sit in the back and listen to you, while 2 other people sneak around and shut the doors, locking them inside. One of my eyebrows raised.
So what's the dilemma?
If they don't get in the back seat, they don't get to talk to you. If they do, they're stuck, he explained. Juvenile but ingenious, I commented as I folded my arms and studied the angry faces behind the window. I tilted my head to one side and furrowed my brow. They look like they belong back there, don't they? More reporter senses? Orion teased. I shook my head.
No, this is something deeper.
Some voice is telling me they're involved in this, and deep. Orion held out his hand to me and smiled. Care to make a bet on that? I arched an eyebrow.
That depends on what's being wagered.
He shrugged.
Let's say you're right, then I get cleaning duties for a week.
I shook my head. No deal, you're cleaner than me. Kitchen duties?
Yeah, definitely a better cook. Spring cleaning chores.
Have you seen me try to operate a rake? He dropped his hand and folded his arms across his chest as he furrowed his brow.
This is harder than I thought.
My eyes flickered to the cop car again, and I pursed my lips.
You've got time.
Don't we have a swamp on the other side of the cemetery to go to? He nodded.
Yeah, and we should go there now.
The priestess won't talk to anyone after sunrise. I sighed.
All right, let's get this over with.
5. A half-hour later found us just passing the old disused cemetery, where we'd had our second caper. I glanced across Orion and out his window as we zoomed by the dark shadows of the tombstones. Why do these things always take us to some spooky place? I muttered as I glanced at Orion. Isn't there some mystical, rainbow-colored forest around here?
There's the park by the river, he reminded me.
You mean the one with the haunted pirate ship? He winced. Right. Forgot about that. I looked ahead and folded my arms across my chest.
So what are we up against in these marty swamps?
Mortel, he corrected me. I raised an eyebrow.
So is that somebody's name?
The guy who found it. A grin slipped onto his lips as he shook his head. Mortel isn't a name, it means deadly in the language of voodoo. I snorted. Of course. So what about the zombies? Generally harmless, but I suggest you don't make any quick movements among them, he warned me. My face fell as I glanced at him. Why? Orion pursed his lips. The zombies are soulless creatures resurrected by the power of the swamps. They're controlled only by their instincts, and anything that moves fast will catch their attention. So did these dead guys come from the cemetery? I wondered. He shook his head. No. There was a battle 180 years ago between the Hollow citizens and a town of humans on the other side of the swamp.
The Hollows won, I guessed.
He nodded. Yeah. The battle was in the swamps where the flying and swimming were, people had the advantage. The humans were massacred, and those that did survive fled the valley. The dead were buried in the soft earth of the swamps.
But they weren't laid to rest, I surmised.
No. There was magic in the swamps that the Hollow people didn't know about, and at the next full moon the dead rose.
So did the zombies try to get revenge?
I asked him. He pursed his lips. In a way. There were a few families near the swamp that were attacked, but their instincts told them they couldn't leave the swamp. I arched an eyebrow.
So what happens if they do leave?
The first couple of years they drop dead. Permanently this time. After 50 years they'd become dust like they were supposed to, and they've stuck to that up until 15 years ago when the last reported zombie death occurred. I leaned forward to catch his eye and smiled at him. You wouldn't happen to have personal experience with that episode, would you? He grinned.
Well, there was this one time where a couple of my friends and I were daring each other.
Aha. So who was the dead? I wondered. He nodded at the road ahead of us.
We're here.
I followed his gaze. On either side of us were the towering pines of the woods, but in front of us rose the thin soft woods of marshland. The trees towered above the murky green waters that stretched far into the distance. Rotting logs and moss-covered rocks dotted the landscape. The full moon barely shone through the thin canopy, but the light was strong enough to reflect along the waters and cast shadows over the eerie silence. The road ended at the water's edge, and we got out. We walked to the edge of the muck, and I swept my eyes over the murky waters. A stench hit my nostrils and made them tingle as though like a sneeze, but none came out. I gasped before I clapped my hand over my nose and mouth.
It smells like rotten eggs, gym socks, and a dead skunk.
Orion pursed his lips as he studied the swamp.
You're probably right about the dead part.
I took a deep breath and dropped my hand.
So where's the priestess live?
He nodded at a wide patch of mold that was lined with dead grass, that wound its way through the rotten logs and trees far into the distance.
It's about 2 miles that way along that path, but we have to be careful.
I arched an eyebrow. Why? Even with all my experience hunting troublemakers, I still don't know this place very well. I doubt even the 4 we met with know what's out there, at least all of it. It's a magic that might be as old as the tree, maybe even older. I wrapped my arms around myself and shuddered. Maybe that's what's giving me these chills. That or that stupid leaf that's in my pocket. As though in reply, the leaf crackled against my pants. Orion took a step onto the path, and turned back to offer me a hand. Come on. We'll get through this. I rolled my eyes but couldn't hide a slight hint of a smile at the corner of my lips. Thanks for the gallantry, but I placed my hands on his back and pushed him forward. I think I can handle walking forward and even left and right.
Wait, he yelped as he dug his heels into the soft ground.
I leaned to one side and caught his eyes.
What?
You're not afraid of a little water, are you?
Not that, he told me as he stooped and picked up a rock.
He skipped it across the surface twice before it stuck in the muck, and with a slurping sound disappeared out of sight. My wide eyes fell on Orion.
What the hell was that?
Quicksand. I balled my hands into fists at my sides and glared at him.
That would have been nice to know before I shoved you.
He pointed at the pathway.
That's our walkway, but don't fall off it or you'll be sucked in faster than milkshake up a straw.
My shoulders fell, and I ran a hand through my hair.
Wonderful.
Anything else I need to know about? Alligators. Man-eating plants. Vacuum salesman. Orion pursed his lips as he looked out over the swamps.
I hope we won't find out.
I inched forward to the tall grass that lined the path, and tapped the murky surface of the water with my toe. My shoe left an imprint that was quickly filled in by water and algae. I drew my foot back and noted a thick stick on the ground. Its length was 4 feet, plenty of distance for me to check ahead of me. I picked it up, and looked at Orion.
All right, lead the way.
We stepped onto the path and followed its winding way through the stench-filled swamp. On occasion I noticed a bubble protrude from the green waters and burst, releasing a scent of skunk-rotten garbage. Other than the infrequent burping of stench gas, all was quiet. I didn't even hear the call of a crow. A buzzing sound flitted about me, and I felt a sharp sting on the back of my neck. Ouch! I grumbled as I slapped the spot. I drew my hand in front of me, and stuck my tongue out as I saw the remains of a mosquito with my blood. A thought struck me, and I looked at Orion's back. Are werewolves immune to malaria? He shook his head.
Not really.
I sighed and wiped my hand on my jeans. If only I was a werewolf or something like that. He glanced over his shoulder at me. Why? Because this place is going to take 9 lives to get through, I quipped as I swept my eyes over the oozing landscape.
So when do we see the zombies?
Orion froze. I stumbled into him. Hey! I snapped as I straightened and glared up at him.
What's the big
SSH, he hissed. His harsh tone made me shut up and look past him. My eyes widened as I beheld the shambling shadows that shuffled across the surface of the swamp. They were human once, that much was obvious, but their features were as rotten as the logs that floated beside them. Men and women, and even a few children, were stooped over with their arms hung in front of them, as they shuffled along at the pace of a tortoise. Their clothes, many in the style of 200 years ago but some more recent, were as rotten as their flesh, and in some cases appeared to have become part of their flesh. The creatures didn't appear to notice us, as they walked along staring straight ahead of themselves with film-covered, empty eyes. Their mouths hung open, and I could see their teeth. Those were long and sharp and showed no signs of decay. Their fingernails, too, were in perfect condition. I pointed at the dagger-like claws and lowered my voice to a whisper. "Do they ever use those?" He pursed his lips and nodded.
"Yes." "And what's their top speed?"
I asked him as I watched them shuffle past us, crossing the path as they did so.
"You don't want to know."
I winced and clutched my stick in front of me in both hands. I glanced down at their shuffling feet. The tops of their feet, or in some cases shoes, peeked out from the swamp water.
"What I would like to know is how they're not sinking like that stone you threw."
He shook his head. "Nobody is quite sure, but it could be due to the magic that revived them being that of the swamp, so they don't face the dangers we do." "Lucky stiffs," I muttered, as we continued on our way. With such a crowd, the going was slower than before. We gave the zombies the right of way, and even the fastest shambling kept us for half a minute at the intersection of us and undead. A 20-minute walk turned into 30, before we walked around a large mound of fallen trees, and found ourselves staring at a very out-of-place Victorian mansion that stood some 50 yards off. The place was like in those horror movies, complete with creepy old porch and grimy impenetrable windows. Ancient shutters hung askew on their nails, and the paint, if there'd ever been any, was long gone, leaving the wood siding to rot and warp in the elements. All that kept the horror house from becoming an oversized piece of driftwood in the swamp was a round, low patch of real earth on which the house stood. The path we followed meandered around a few more logs, trees, and about 24 zombies before it joined the solid earth. We were almost there. I frowned as the scent of swamp hit my nostrils. This time the odor didn't just tingle my nose, it downright assaulted it, and with it came the sensation of a sneeze. I wrinkled my nose to fend off the feeling, but my nose wouldn't obey. Orion glanced over his shoulder at me.
"We have to stay quiet for just a
achoo." The sound of my powerful sneeze echoed over the water and bounced off the tree trunks. For the first time the zombies lifted their heads and all eyes fell on us. Orion stepped back and stretched out his arm in front of me, as the creatures turned toward us and stood straight.
"What's happening?"
I whispered, as Orion and I took a step back as the zombies glared at us. "They know we're here," he told me as he grasped my hand in his. His fingers lengthened as he slowly transformed into his werewolf form, and nodded at the island of earth.
"We have to make a break for the house across the swamp."
My mouth dropped open.
"What about the quicksand?"
The zombies let out a loud collective groan and rushed us. Their speed was that of a cheetah, and so were their fingernails as they stretched out their claws toward us. Their once placid faces were twisted with rage and hunger. "Quicksand's looking really good about now," I yelled. "Transform," Orion shouted. In a blink of an eye he was a werewolf, but I wasn't so quick at the fur. My feet and hands transformed before anything else, leaving me heavy-handed and stumble-footed. The zombies lunged at us and Orion leapt upward far above their heads, taking me with him as he still held my hand.
"Not ready,"
I yelped. 6. We made a splash, landing on one of the half-sunken logs. Swamp water flew up and coated our fur in a thin slime. I didn't have time to choke on the mucky water before the zombies turned on a dime and flung themselves at us, with their gnashing teeth eager to sink into our flesh. Orion pulled me into his arms and lunged forward into the void of swamp water where no log awaited us. Instead, Orion used the heads of the zombies as stepping stones across the deadly water. I had a hard time focusing on my transformation, as we bounced from noggin to noggin, an inch away from death in both the literal and figurative senses. Unfortunately, he ran out of heads about 50 feet from the finish line. "Get ready," he shouted. "For what?" I returned. Orion leapt off the last head, and lifted me above himself. I yelped and squirmed as he gave a great roar and tossed me far ahead. The marshy water flew past as I arched over it, and landed with a hard bump onto the solid earth. I rolled for a few feet, before a considerate rock stopped me, when my side collided with its harder and heavier body. I sat up and rubbed my bruised side. "Damn you, Orion, what the hell?" I lifted my eyes and gasped. Orion was waist deep in the swamp water and sinking fast. "Orion!" I yelled as I scrambled to my feet and rushed to the edge of the water. "Stay back," he commanded me. Our pursuers sped toward him with fingernails at the ready, and sharp teeth bared. They bore down on him and grabbed at his coat and hair, yanking back his head so others could get at his throat. "Stop!" I shouted. "Please stop it." And they did. The 24 zombies, with Orion in their grasp, froze. I blinked at the sight before me of so many rotten statues surrounding Orion, who had his teeth clenched because his hair was still held tight, even as he sunk a little lower with each passing second. I cleared my throat. Let him go." The zombies opened their decayed hands and released Orion. He straightened his head and looked around at the undead before his attention fell on me. "What are you doing?" he whispered. I shook my head as I replied in a low voice. "I have no idea." Orion glanced down at himself. He was now buried up to mid-chest in the swamp. "Tell them to get me out of here." "I'll lift him out of there," I ordered the zombies. They grabbed Orion's arms and pulled him out of the oozing water. Well, almost. They lifted him as high as their masticated arms could reach, but because Orion was so tall his feet kept getting sucked into the swamp. He bent his knees and tucked his legs up against him. I took a step back and pointed at the ground where I'd just stood. "Bring him over here." The zombies carried him stiff-armed over the water and to dry, solid ground. "Drop him." Our former foes opened their hands and dumped Orion onto the ground. I leaned down and smiled at him as he clenched his teeth and raised himself to a seated position. "Neat, huh?" Orion's narrowed eyes flickered to our large audience. "It'd be neater if you could tell them to leave." I looked up at my personal servants and waved my hand at them. "All right, go on and do whatever you usually do," they glared at me and raised their long fingernails, "except that. Don't attack us again. Or anybody else. Now go. Go on." The zombies turned and shuffled off into the swamp. I grabbed Orion's arm and helped him to his feet. His clothes stank of swamp and his shoes squished whenever he set his foot down. Orion looked from the retreating zombies and back to me. "How did you get them to do that?" I shrugged and shook my head. "I don't know. Maybe just saying please did it." He shook his head. "I really doubt that. My animal magnetism? Admirable, but other wares have ventured into here and not been so lucky," he pointed out. I folded my arms and studied him with a sly smile. "You mean like when they dare each other?" He pursed his lips but nodded. "Yes. I was lucky because only one saw me, and I was at the edge of the swamps." A cold chill swept over me and made me shiver. As much as I want to tease you about your childhood antics, what I really want is to leave this place as soon as possible. It feels like somebody just stepped on my grave. Orion studied me for a brief moment with a furrowed brow before he turned toward the house. I followed him, and we both stared up at the creepy abode. With the closer view, I could see the myriad of cobwebs that adorned the porch and hung inside the windows like wispy curtains. I thought I saw one of the upstairs curtains move, but it could have been a draft. A few of the other windows were broke and boarded up. The ancient weathered door hung askew on its rusted hinges. The porch steps groaned beneath our feet as we walked up to the door. A Mali knocker, with the appearance of a rotted corpse, hung on the door. "So what's this priestess look like?" I whispered to Orion, as he grabbed the handle. He shook his head.
I have no idea. What do you? Orion gave 3 solid knocks.
The sound reverberated through the house and rattled the door. I swallowed the lump in my throat and glanced up at Orion. You guys ever hear of a story about ghosts called A Christmas Story? A hint of a smile flickered across his lips.
We're not that isolated. Just checking.
We waited a minute before Orion frowned and knocked again, this time louder. A few of the cobwebs above us fluttered down and landed in my hair. I cringed and pulled out the sticky threads.
I don't think she wants any visitors.
Orion pursed his lips and grabbed the knob. He gave it a turn, and the door swung into the house a few inches. I glimpsed a small entrance hall with a worn rug atop a wood floor. Orion leaned his head. Hello, Madam Corvus. No reply.
He took a step inside. Priestess.
I grabbed his arm and yanked him backward, so he stumbled back onto the porch.
What the hell are you doing?
She could put a hex on you, steal your credit card number, or do something really bad. He shook his head.
There's something wrong.
She rarely leaves her home.
Well, maybe this is one of those times where she went mushroom hunting.
A chill ran down my spine. I wrapped my arms around myself and shivered. Damn it.
That feeling again, he guessed.
It's probably my reporter senses telling me this is one scoop we don't want, I told him.
We have to see if she's here, he insisted as he slipped through the partially open door and disappeared from view.
I made to follow him, but on the threshold something made me pause and look over my shoulder. The zombies stood at the edge of the solid ground and surrounded the house. Their numbers were several dozen deep, as they all faced the building and stared at the house with their empty, glossy eyes. Orion. I think there's something you need to see out here, I called out to him. He reappeared with a frown on his face.
What's the? His eyes followed mine and widened. What the hell? He whispered. I think that's a pretty close estimate, I mused.
Orion pursed his lips and shook his head.
This has to be because of the priestess. Let's go find her.
He dove back into the house. I glanced one last time at the strange sight before I followed him inside. Spiders and dust rained over the entire house, coating the contents. The entrance hall was small, with stairs against the left wall that led to the second floor. To our right was another wall, with an entrance into the dingy, dark living room. I glanced to my left, where the wall divided the hall from the dining room. Against the wall stood a large piece of wood furniture with a front made of lattice. It was long and low, and looked as heavy as a whale. The well-dusted piece of furniture was out of place among the grotesque animal heads that hung from the molding wallpaper, and the spindly chairs that stood against the walls. They were hidden beneath piles of books, papers, and the odd dead mouse. I stepped over to the dusted furniture, and ran my hand over the smooth surface. My mom would kill for this buffet, I commented as I looked over my shoulder at Orion. His attention, however, was entirely on the rickety set of stairs that led to the second floor. His nostrils were flared and his eyes were narrowed. I stepped up to his side and glanced up the stairs. They were rickety, and a few were cracked.
What is it?
I asked him. Orion frowned. I smell blood. He reached out and grasped my hand.
Stay close to me.
That familiar cold chill stuck to my bones as we crept up the stairs. We reached the landing, and a long hallway stretched out before us. Doors stood on either side, but only one was open, the one on our left and 2 doors down. The passage was dark, but a faint flicker of light stretched out through the open door. Stay here, Orion whispered to me. I glanced around at our shadowed surroundings and snorted.
Not on your life, because it might mean mine.
Together we tiptoed down the hall, with me hitting every squeak and squawk of the old boards until we reached the entrance. Orion set his palm on the door and swung it open so we could view the whole room. It was a bedroom with a bed covered in fur sheets, and a myriad of books and papers strewn about. Across from us were 2 grimy windows that looked out on the swamp, one of which was open. The bed was flanked on both sides by small tables with a mess of candles used down to nubbins. There was a ring of the same nubbins around the bed. We stepped inside and looked around. "So I thought I heard you say earlier that you didn't know what the priestess looked like," I commented. "I couldn't pick her out of a lineup," he agreed. I glanced at him and arched an eyebrow.
"Why not?"
"Haven't you met her?"
"No.
She never left the swamp, and I haven't been this deep in it," he explained as he rifled through some of the papers that lay on a table behind the door. I took a couple of steps forward to the foot of the bed, and grasped the rough wood that made up the frame. The stench of the unwashed furs hit my nostrils, as did the blood scent that Orion's more acute nose had smelled downstairs. Something caught my eye that made me lean to the left and look on the floor. My eyes widened, and my mouth dropped open. A tiny voice in my head told me one thing: scream. So I did. 7. Orion rushed to my side and grabbed my upper arms. I pointed at the floor, upon which lay the body of a woman. She was clad in a tattered old ankle-length dress with bangles, bones and bells stitched at odd intervals. Her eyes were open and looked at the ceiling, but there was no life in them. The cause of that was the hideous jagged gash across her throat, from which blood had poured and soaked the skin that lay beneath her. "My God," Orion whispered. I needed some divine help at that moment to keep my legs from buckling. My knees shook like jello in an earthquake, and I would have fallen if Orion hadn't held me so tight. He turned to me and pursed his lips. "Are you all right?" My eyes were glued to that pale, lifeless face as I shook my head. No. "Over here," Orion instructed as he helped me over to a chair that sat beside a cluttered table. It was out of sight of the woman. "Don't move." I shook my head. A stampede of rhinos couldn't have gotten me to move an inch from that spot. Orion stepped over to the body and knelt beside it. He reached out of my view, and I heard the rustle of clothing as he moved her dress around. "What are you doing?" I hissed.
"Finding out what I can," he replied.
"The police don't usually like their bodies moved," I reminded him. "The police won't be able to come until we call them, and we can't do that until we get out of the swamp," he told me. I frowned and pulled out my cell phone. There was no reception. Orion lifted one of her hands high enough that I could see the pale flesh of her fingers.
"It looks like she put up a struggle."
"There's something underneath her fingernails." I shuddered and looked away to my left where the table stood. The surface was littered with papers, but atop them all was a hell of a weight. The weight was a thick, leather-clad volume that caught my attention for its lack of dust. The title was in bright yellow letters, and read "The History of the Hollow, as compiled by the librarian." I grabbed the heavy cover and opened the book to the table of contents. Everything was handwritten in a neat hand on rough parchment, yellowed with age. Most of the chapter titles were generic, such as The Beginning and Colonizing, but there was one that caught my attention.
"The Chosen Caretakers,"
I whispered. Orion sighed as he leaned back and shook his head. "Damn it. I can't smell anything over this blood and rat crap." I glanced over my shoulder at Orion, who still knelt beside the body. "Orion, I think you need to look at this." He stood and pursed his lips as he kept his eyes on the body.
"It's a horrible way to die. This might be something to do with the why part of her murder," I told him.
He lifted his eyes to me and furrowed his brow before he walked over. I partially closed the cover and tapped the front over the word librarian. "There's only been one librarian, right?" He furrowed his brow before he nodded.
"Yes."
I rose to my feet and slipped up to his side as I turned the book to face us.
"Then let's see what he wrote about himself," I suggested as I flipped the pages to the section on caretakers.
There were 4 entries in the chapter index, those of Mab the librarian, Sage and Troy. A short sentence was written below the chapter title. I leaned forward and squinted to read the fine handwriting aloud. "Those who were granted long life by the tree in order to care for its many aspects." I paused and wrinkled my nose before I glanced up at Orion. Aspects? He shook his head.
I have no idea.
I returned my attention to the book, and turned the page. On the left-hand page was a sketch of Mab, but in a dress like you'd see one of Jane Austen's characters wearing. On the opposite page was her name in a fancy scrawl, and below that was a short paragraph. Mistress of magic, and caretaker of the same. Bound to this spot by love, and worshipped by the witches of old. Orion turned the page, and revealed the librarian's picture. He wore spectacles and an old-fashioned suit. Orion read aloud his description. Caretaker, of the knowledge accumulated in the minds of the people of the valley. Entrusted with recording all that was and is done. I tapped on his picture. Would the librarian had let the priestess borrow something like this? Orion pursed his lips and shook his head.
I don't think so.
If my guess is correct, I'd say this came from the forbidden section of the library. Who'd have access to that besides the four? I asked him. The mayor and maybe also, but outside of them I can't think of anyone, he told me.
Then how'd this get here?
I mused as I turned the page. Sage's dated hand-drawn image smiled back at us. Caretaker of the tree, and mistress of the ceremony. Bound to its life and hers to it. I arched an eyebrow.
What the heck does that mean?
Turn the page. I want to read what Troy's is about, Orion requested. I turned the page and revealed a sketch of Troy. He was dressed in the same old-fashioned suit as the librarian, and wasn't aged a day. Caretaker of fate. He guides all the lives of those in the valley. Caretaker of fate. Orion repeated. I turned to the next entry, but the page after Troy's entry was blank. I flipped the page again and found the next chapter. Orion picked up the tome, and flipped to the beginning. His eyes traveled down the long list of chapters, before they flickered to me. How'd you guess to look there for their entries? I shook my head.
I didn't guess.
I remembered Troy saying something about them being caretakers, so I knew that'd be important. Orion returned his attention to the book, and flipped through the opening chapters. This history starts at the founding of the town. I leaned against his side and glanced at the words. And it's written in first person, I pointed out. A noise downstairs caught our attention. A board groaned. My eyes widened, and I whipped my head to Orion. Footsteps. He shoved the book into my arms, and raced out of the room. I rolled my eyes before I tossed the book onto the table, and hurried after him. We clattered down the passage and stairs to the front hall. The door was open, and the zombies still stood in their silent vigil, but now their eyes were turned upward at the sky. Orion and I rushed onto the lawn, and turned to see at what they stared. A shadow disappeared over the roof, to the other side of the house. We sprinted across the slick swamp grass. My foot slipped on a particularly wet spot on the side of the house, and I fell on my butt. Orion disappeared around the back. I growled and scurried to my feet after him. I found him standing in the middle of a large backyard that stretched 100 feet, before it was stopped by a thick mess of moss-covered trees. His hard eyes were turned up at the canopy, as were those of the zombies that surrounded the house. I reached him, and clapped my hands on my knees as I doubled over gasping for breath.
Well, that was it?
He shook his head.
I'm not sure.
I saw something fly into the trees, but that's it. My gaze was turned to the ground, and something near Orion's foot caught my eyes. I pointed at the object.
What's that?
Orion followed my finger, and stooped to pick it up. He lifted the feather to his face, and turned it between his fingers as he furrowed his brow.
It's a turkey feather. So did Thanksgiving dinner get away?
I quipped. He pursed his lips and shook his head.
There aren't many turkeys in the valley, and none in the swamps.
Maybe the murderer got a little voodoo sacrifice on them, when they ran off? I suggested. Or was wearing it to get away, he mused. I arched an eyebrow. What? Like a wood turkey or something? He nodded. There is someone, and only one person, who fits that description. The person who you told me had a grudge against the tree? I guessed.
Yeah.
The only person who has a grudge against the tree, he corrected me, as he tucked the feather into his coat and turned back to the house. We'll look around a little more, and see if we can find anything more conclusive. I straightened and winced as my back popped. And get that book. I tossed it. I paused and swept my eyes over the area.
Where are they going?
Orion followed my gaze. The zombies that had surrounded had turned their backs, and were shuffling off into the swamp. He shook his head.
I wish I could figure out why they were here in the first place.
I grabbed his hand and tugged him toward the house.
Let's not wait around to find an answer.
We strode back into the house and upstairs to the room of death. I stepped inside and gagged. Why's the blood smell so bad now? The blood was still seeping from the wound when we arrived, so now there's more of it, Orion explained as he strode over to the body. I followed him as far as the little table, and peeked around the side of the bed. The priestess now lay in a pool of her own blood, but the life fluid was starting to turn darker from oxidation. So I guess that means we really did chase the murderer out of here. Orion furrowed his brow, as he knelt beside the body.
Yes, but if that's true, I wonder why Abby didn't just fly across the floorboards.
I arched an eyebrow. Who's Abby?
The turkey.
Ah. So that would make this a murder most foul? Orion lifted his head, and glared at me. I held up my hands.
All right, I admit that was bad, but it's only because this place gives me my breath caught in my throat.
Orion stood, and hurried over to me.
What is it?
What's wrong? I pointed a shivering finger at the body. Did she just move? The corpse twitched. I yelped and leapt back into Orion's arms. He tensed as the priestess's eyes flew open. They were covered in a thin film, and devoid of life. She raised herself to a sitting position, staring forward all the time without blinking. I shrank back against Orion, and lowered my voice to a whisper.
What's happening?
The magic of the swamps, he told me as the priestess stood and shambled toward the door. His eyes followed her as he pursed his lips.
It looks like even she isn't immune to its effects.
The zombie priestess disappeared into the hall. I relaxed, but allowed myself a shudder. Could we get out of here now? He nodded.
Yeah.
I turned back to the table, and swept my eyes over the top for the book. A frown slipped onto my lips. Did you grab the book? He shook his head. No, why? I lifted a few odd papers and books. Because it's not there. A thumping noise made both of us jump. It was followed by another. I whipped my head to the door as my heartbeat drummed to a heavy metal band tune.
What's that?
Orion grabbed my hand, and dragged me out into the hall and to the top of the stairs. We looked down the flight of steps and saw the zombie priestess. She stood before the out-of-place piece of furniture, and the thump we heard was her repeatedly walking into it. I glanced at Orion, and pointed a finger at the priestess. Do new zombies usually do that? He pursed his lips and shook his head. No. The zombies are dumb, but they're not that dumb.
Well, how about you, let her out and I'll try to see why she was bumping into, I suggested.
Orion walked down the steps and opened the door. The sight of the swamps made the priestess stop her odd music making and turn to the door. She shuffled outside with Orion close behind her, to heed the call of the swamp with its other zombie occupants. I had earlier inspected the top of the long piece of furniture, so I knelt in front of the two doors that flanked the lattice. The left door hid nothing but two shelves and a few years of dust. I opened the right-hand door and paused. Before me, laying on the upper shelf, was the familiar cover of the history book. I drew it out, and looked over the cover. It was definitely the same front, and a perusal of the contents told me it was the same book. I glanced back at the open cabinet door. A small silver jewelry box sat on the bottom shelf. I pulled it out and sniffed the crack between the lid and body. My regret was instant as a strong odor of bath salts hit my sensitive nostrils. I choked on the scent as I climbed to my feet. Orion entered and found me still coughing.
What's wrong?
I held out the box toward him. He winced and leaned back.
What the hell is that?
Bath salts. I guess Troy wasn't lying, I commented as I turned the book over in one hand. Orion frowned. Where'd you find that? I nodded at the open door. In there, though it beats me how it got in there. Orion grasped my upper arm and shook his head. I don't know, and like you said, I don't think we want to find out, at least not until we've had a chance to tell also about the murder. Let's go. 8. We hurried through the swamp and back to the car. I lay the book on my lap as we drove back to town. Night still reigned over the valley as we drove into town and stopped at the police station. Orion stopped the car and turned to me. Whatever you don't want impounded as evidence needs to be left in the car. Good idea, I agreed as I set the book and tin on the floor before we got out. The lights were on, and somebody was at home at the front desk. The burly officer had grayish skin, and his nose looked as hard as a rock. The small plate over his left breast pocket told me his name was Nashorn. He looked up from his paperwork, and arched his eyebrow as he studied us as we stepped into the small entrance hall. His gaze fell on Orion, and he leaned back in his chair and grinned.
Well, well, if it isn't the mighty hunter.
What have you got for us at this hour? A murder, my stone-faced mate answered as we reached the desk. The officer's face fell, and he glared at us with a scrutinizing glance.
That's not funny. No, and it's the truth.
The priestess was murdered tonight, Orion informed him. The man leaned forward and arched an eyebrow.
No kidding.
I rolled my eyes and looked past him. Where the hell is a real police officer when we need them? The officer stood and puffed out his ample chest. Whatever it is. I'll handle it, a voice spoke up. Also appeared out of his office and strode over to us. His eyes flickered between us. Well, what now? Could we talk about this in private? Orion requested. Also pursed his lips, but half turned and jerked his head in the direction of his office. He led us into the small office and shut the door behind us. The chief crossed his arms over his chest as we turned to face him. Well, the priestess was murdered less than an hour ago, Orion told him. Orso's face darkened. Any idea who did it? Orion shook his head. Not a clue. I opened my mouth, but a warning glance from Orion made me shut it. The chief sighed and ran a hand through his thinning hair. First the ceremony, then the library, and now this. He paused and his eyes flickered between us. You wouldn't happen to have any evidence these are linked, would you? We have a leaf, a book, and a tin of bath salts, Orion told him. Also shut his eyes and pinched the bridge of his nose. This is serious, Orion, especially if what you're telling me is the truth. I frowned. Of course it's the truth. You think we'd lie about a murder just to get our names on the front page of the local rag? The chief dropped his hand to his side and sighed. All right, I'll send out one of our flying officers to go check it out. Orion shook his head. He won't find a body. Also frowned at him. It got up and walked off, didn't it? I nodded. Yep. The chief's eyes flickered to Orion. So what's my men supposed to be looking for? She was killed by her throat being clawed open. Her blood should still be on the rug in her bedroom, Orion pointed out. Orso nodded. All right, my men will get on it, but I want a full statement from both of you before you leave. A full statement, understand? Perfectly, Orion confirmed. Orso opened the door and led us out into the desk area. Give your statements to Officer Nashorn at the front desk. The chief turned away from us, and to a few thin uniformed officers at the rear. Storch guns, I need you to go out to the priestess house and take a look around. See what you can find. One of the men winced.
I don't think I should go, sir.
I heard she uses geese in her magic. She's been reported murdered, so quit your excuses and get out there, also snapped. While he ordered his men about, I leaned against Orion and lowered my voice to a whisper.
Why didn't you tell him about the feather? We don't have any proof it's Abby, he pointed out. And why'd you tell him the truth about what we had?
He grinned. The best strategy is to keep your lies as few as possible, especially when you know you're not going to be believed. Orion, Miss Lyle, get those statements written, the chief commanded us. Orion and I stood at attention and saluted him.
Yes, sir, we shouted.
The corners of his lips twitched upward, but he waved us off and returned to his men. Orion and I strode to the front desk, where Nashorn pushed 2 pieces of paper at us along with a sneer.
Hurry up.
I don't have all night. A sly grin slipped onto my lips as I pressed my palm against the paper, and slowly, carefully, tortuously slid the slip closer to myself. 1 inch at a time. Nashorn's greyish complexion took on a reddish hue as his thick eyebrows crashed down. Orion grabbed my paper and his, and slipped them in front of us. He handed me a pen and caught my eyes in his own. Write fast. I arched an eyebrow but wrote fast, omitting several important words like the, a, and a few unused vowels. We finished our statements, handed them to the unamused officer, and walked out of the station. I glanced at my partner.
So what was the deal back there?
Have you ever heard about angry rhinos? He asked me. I shrugged. A little. He walked around the front of the car. They charge and they're very fast. So what you're saying is I was making a rhino mad? Orion paused and looked at me over the roof of the car. Very. Oh, I replied as he slipped inside. I slipped inside and picked up the evidence of our adventure, the book and tin. I lifted the tin in one hand, and the book in the other. I don't know whether we should go to the library or Troy's motel. Neither, Orion replied as he drove us away from the curb. I dropped my full hands into my lap and arched an eyebrow.
So where to?
Home. I fell back against my seat and frowned at him. Come on, it's only, I glanced at my watch, 4 a.m. We've got plenty of time to get into trouble. He stifled a yawn. And not enough energy to win against it, so we're going to bed. Tomorrow we'll go to the library, and ask the librarian how that book got there. I slumped in my seat and pursed my lips as I turned my face away toward the window.
I'm not sleepy,
I muttered. Escaping a murder attempt, and zombies isn't exciting enough for you? He teased. I shrugged. I don't know. I guess maybe it's this case. The case you were reluctant to take, he reminded me. I glanced at him with a frown. I know, but there's just something I don't know. I looked at my lap and the book that lay on it. I brushed my hand over the cover, and shook my head. There's just something I feel like I need to know. He arched an eyebrow. What's that? I snorted and shrugged. Heck if I know. Maybe what Troy promised us, he guessed. It could be, I mused as I leaned my head back against the seat and watched the streets fly by. I just feel like there's something deep I need to learn. After sunrise, he insisted. I sighed.
All right, after sunrise.
9. We went to bed, and I dreamed uneasy dreams about turkey people rising from the swamps as zombies. The foul dream was interrupted just shy of sunrise, by a persistent pounding in my head. If this is you, you're early getting me up, Orion muttered beside me. I sat up and glared at him, buried as he was in the covers. If this was my doing, you'd be out of bed complaining about my cold feet. Now get up and help me answer the door. We threw on our bathrobes and stumbled downstairs to the door. I was in the lead, and flung it open. In the gloom of early morning stood Aunt Snoop. She was fully dressed with a wide smile on her face that spelled trouble, and not the kind I wanted to get into. "I'm sorry to wake you up so early, my dears, but there's something I've just got to tell you," she explained. I rubbed one of my sleepy eyes. "Can't it wait? I was just about to be eaten in my dream." She stood to her full height, which was a half a head shorter than mine, and puffed out her chest.
"Well, if you don't want to hear about the tree, then that's fine with me."
My eyes widened, but Orion grabbed the door and frowned at his relation. "I would rather hear about sheep jumping over a fence. Now good night, Aunt Snoop." He slammed the door in her face and turned away from the entrance. Aunt Snoop's heavy footsteps stomped off the porch. I spun around and glared at him.
"That was just getting good." "Not sunrise," he muttered as he shuffled toward the staircase.
Orion had one foot on the bottom step when his phone on the kitchen counter rang. He paused and his shoulders fell. I strode over to the counter and picked up the phone. The number was for Orso. I answered it.
"What's up, Chief?"
"I need you to grab Orion and his aunt and come down to the station at once," Orso ordered me. I frowned.
"Aunt Snoop?
"Why her?" "Because she's spreading a rumor that I want to hear from the ass's lips. Now get her down here now." Click. I pulled the phone away and glared at the end of call screen. "He's pushier than usual." "Who was that?" Orion asked me as he shuffled up. "Orso. He wants us down at the station with Aunt Snoop. Something about that rumor she wanted to tell us about." I couldn't suppress my smile as his face fell. "You can count sheep later, Big Bad Wolf. Now let's go." We dressed and walked the few short yards between the houses to Aunt Snoop's porch. Orion knocked on the door with pursed lips. The door creaked open a crack, and Aunt Snoop's single narrowed eye peeked out.
"Well,"
Orion sighed,
"we'd like to hear about that rumor you told us about."
Her frown deepened, but her natural instinct to gossip made her open the door. She looked her nephew up and down.
"What made you change your mind?"
"Chief Orso, and he wants to hear about the rumor too," Orion informed her. A smile brightened her face as she grabbed her coat that hung on the hook beside the door and stepped out.
"Why didn't you tell me? Let's not keep the good chief waiting."
We piled into the car and drove to Main Street. Our way passed by Mab's diner, or would have if our path hadn't been blocked by a large mob that crowded around the front of her diner. The looks on their faces were anger, and many clutched a small slip of paper in their hands. One of the onlookers was Myrtle Parsons, matriarch of the newspaper clan. Her wizened figure could barely see above the crowd, but her hand scribbled quick notes on a pad of paper as a sly smile graced her lips. "Vulture," I muttered. Orion slowed to a stop just shy of the crowd and shut off the car. He glanced over his shoulder at his aunt. "Stay here." She frowned. "But..." "Stay." He and I stepped out and walked to the edge of the group of people. Among them was Anna Hall, assistant to the coroner. I squeezed between a pair of curious men and sidled up to her so I could tug on her arm. She jumped and whipped her head to me. Her expression softened and she smiled at me.
"You scared me."
I nodded at the people ahead of me.
"What's going on?" "It's because of the flyer," she told me.
"What flyer?" She lifted her hand and showed me one of the crinkled slips of paper.
"This."
I took the folded paper from her and opened it. Typed on the white sheet of printing paper was a short paragraph. "You citizens may know Mab as the owner of the diner, and another were just like you, but in reality, she is a powerful and immortal witch. She has not only cavorted with the Amazons, but has been their leader. Now she uses her power and influence to control the town."
"Holy shit,"
I muttered, as Orion came up beside me. I handed him the note. "Read this." He took the paper and perused the contents. His eyes widened, but he gathered himself quickly before he pursed his lips and raised his gaze to the front of Mab's diner. "We need to get to the door." I could wholeheartedly agree. The mood among the crowd was dark, as the people clamored around the shut doors of the diner. The lights were on, but I didn't see any movement. That is, until a great figure marched through the establishment and flung open the doors. Captain Hendrik van der Deeken stepped out with a pistol in one hand and a cutlass in the other. His fiery eyes swept over the crowd and made them scramble back, leading to a domino effect of pushing and shoving that made the tempers hotter. "Remind me to tell him wielding weapons isn't good crowd control measures," I snapped at Orion as we were jostled by those around us. Van der Deeken raised his sword above his head and snarled at the crowd. "Get back to ye if ye know what's good for ye." One of the lead men held up the folded paper.
"Not until Mab tells us what this means." "Yeah. That's right. We have to get up there," I shouted to Orion. He nodded, and began the hard slog through the tightly packed people. "You're with her, aren't you? An immortal, right?" someone asked the captain. Van der Deeken took a step toward them, and swung his cutlass in an arch before him. The women screamed, and the men shouted as they scrambled back. "That be none of your business, now shove off before I scuttle ya." "Hendrik!" Mab shouted as she emerged from the diner. She yanked his sword arm against his chest and glared at him. "You're making things." "What's this about, Mab?" a man shouted at her as he waved the paper. "What's it mean that you're controlling us?" Another chimed in. "Is it true? What's going on?" Mab snatched the paper from one of the men in front and read over the contents. She pursed her lips and lifted her gaze to the angry faces of the crowd. "Who wrote this?" "Is it true?" a woman questioned her. Mab shook her head. "I can't say, but does anyone know who?" "You can't or you won't," one in the mob spoke up. The anger was palpable as Orion and I finally broke through front of the crowd and into the open space so generously created by Van der Deeken. Orion grasped Mab's arm and leaned his mouth near her ear. "What's going on?" She shook her head. "I don't know." "What are you doing, Orion?" someone yelled. "Are you in on this too?" another shouted. I turned to face the people and swept my eyes over the hot-headed crowd. "In on what?" "This," a man told me as he held up the paper. "What's it mean, Mab?" "It means you guys need to lay off the tabloid journalism." "That stuff's addicting," I quipped. The man sneered at me. "You're that new girl, aren't you?" "That Lyle woman." "You've hardly been here a half year," someone spoke up. "What would you know?" "You're practically an outsider," someone shouted. I crossed my arms over my chest and glared at the mob of angry faces. "I might be an outsider, but I've been here long enough to learn a few things about what Mab does around here." I turned to one in the crowd, a farmer by the name of Fred. "Fred, remember when you got that flat?" "Who was the one who treated you while they were fixing the tire at the shop?" He blushed and turned his eyes down to the ground. "It was Mab." I pointed at an older woman. "What about you, Mrs. Beachcomber? You were sick with the flu for a week, and who sent up food to you?" She shrank into herself, but her voice was clear. "It was Mab." My gaze fell on Anna. "And Anna, remember when you forgot to order Calavar's lunch? Who made you one up and didn't charge you?" She smiled and nodded. "It was Mab." I swept my eyes over the crowd. Many averted their eyes. A few shifted from foot to foot. I could keep listing off a bunch of stories, and that's just what's happened since I got here. If an outsider like me has seen this many things that Mab's done for you, then you guys should know a heck of a lot more. But what about the paper?" a man meekly spoke up. I snorted. "What does it prove?" "Nothing. No sources, no name, nothing. I'd find a better sourced story in the National Enquirer." A few snickers arose from the crowd. Myrtle raised her wizened hand as her dark eyes glared at me. "What do you know about the paper?" I glanced down the road. "Nothing, but I do know you'd all better get out of here." "Why?" someone asked.
I pointed in the direction I gazed down. Because the cops are coming. It was like watching a tennis match, where everyone whipped their heads in the same direction. Their eyes widened as they glimpsed the familiar markings of a patrol car, as it hurried down the road toward us. I couldn't resist myself, as I cupped my hands over my mouth. Scatter. Everyone scattered like mice before the cat cop, leaving behind the papers and their anger. Myrtle was jostled around by the fleeing people. She kept her balance and in a few seconds stood alone in the street. The old newshound tucked her pen and pad into her coat, and glared up at me one last time before she strode off. I watched her leave, as Orion sidled up to me with a smile on his face.
I didn't know you were such a good public speaker.
I ran a hand through my hair as a slight headache hit me. I didn't, either. The police vehicle pulled up, and the two officers stepped out to find themselves alone with our little group. I crossed my arms over my chest and glared at the pair as they strode up to us. Took you guys long enough.
There's problems down at City Hall and the police station too, one of the officers explained before he turned to Orion. What happened here?
Orion picked up one of the sheets of paper and handed it to him.
This got a few people riled up.
The officer took the slip and read the contents. He raised his eyes to Mab. Do you know what it means? Van der Deacon lay a hand on one of her shoulders and glared at the officer. What are you implying, ya? Mab held up her hand and silenced him. She returned her attention to the officer and shook her head. I'm not sure what it means, but I'd like to find out who spread them. Until we find that out, you'd better come to the station with us for your own safety, the officer advised. Mab nodded before she turned to the captain and smiled at him. Protect the ship from harm, will you, Hendrik? He grasped her hands and caught her gaze in his own. I, as if it were my own. Orion looked to the officer in charge. We'll follow you. Orso's expecting us. All right. Let's go. 10. We climbed back into our car and found a very excited Aunt Snoop.
That was positively breathtaking, Trixie.
You knocked them down with a feather of a speech. I crossed my arms and stared ahead. Why do I get the feeling I only tamped down a wildfire? The library, Orion reminded me as we followed the police car to the station. I glanced at him and arched an eyebrow. You think they're related, don't you? He pursed his lips and nodded. I do. I sighed and sank down in my seat. It is a little too much to be a coincidence, isn't it? I mean, one of them, or at least where they work, gets attacked, and the next day another one is nearly mobbed. Aunt Snoop popped her head out from the back seat and glanced at us. One what? What are you two talking about?
Just that fire last night in the library, Orion assured her.
She snorted. Fire? It was more like an explosion. My bedroom windows rattled so hard I thought they'd break. Her keen eyes flickered between us, and a sly smile slipped onto her lips. I did read in the paper that you two were there when it happened. I glanced at Orion.
I bet they had the story written before it happened.
He cast me a warning glance. Aunt Snoop arched an eyebrow. What's this? Are you talking about the Parsons family? We were there, Aunt Snoop, but we don't know any more than you do about what caused it, Orion informed her.
But why were you there? She persisted.
I had some overdue library books, and the librarian wanted to tear into me without too many witnesses, I quipped. Aunt Snoop turned up her nose. You're a terrible liar, Miss Lyle. I couldn't hide a little smile at her sudden formality, but I suppose you have a point. She slumped back into her seat and sighed. As Mirabelle was telling us just last night, we shouldn't believe everything we read, paper or note. Orion furrowed his brow as he glanced at her through the rear view mirror.
Why'd she say that?
His aunt smiled and shook her head.
That's a story I won't tell until we see Chief Orso. Now hurry along before I burst with excitement.
We reached the police station that adjoined the city hall, and found ourselves thick in another crowd of people. They too held tightly to the troublesome notes and talked among themselves like co-conspirators. The police car in front of us turned at the last intersection and drove into the alley that split the block in half. We followed, and both cars stopped at the back entrance to the station. Our party slipped inside to find the station a madhouse. Phones rang off the hook as officers tried to comfort the concerned voices on the other end. Several other officers stood outside the front doors, blocking the way for the mob and trying to disperse them, without any luck. Also stood in the doorway of his office and swept his troubled eyes over the chaos. He glanced in our direction as we walked down the narrow hall toward the front of the building. "All of you, in my office. You too," he pointed a finger at his officers. "Get at a phone and tell anyone who calls that we're looking into it, and that's all, got it?" They nodded. The chief stepped inside and we followed, leaving the officers to their phone duties. Another person stood in the corner of the office and turned to us as we entered. It was Sage. Her bright eyes fell on me, and a smile slipped onto her lips. She approached me and grasped my upper arms as she studied my face. "An admirable speech, Miss Lyle. I doubt any but the oldest residents could have given a better one." I leaned away from her and frowned.
"How do you know about that?"
She chuckled.
"Nothing so mysterious."
The good captain phoned me and explained the entire circumstance, including a full report of your speech.
"And why are you here?"
I persisted. "I came to ask Chief Orso about the notes," she told me. Orion nodded at the pamphlet that I still held in my hand, as his gaze fell on the mistress of the tree. "Any idea who might have spread these?" Sage's smile fell from her lips as she shook her head.
"The letters about Mab?"
"No. All anyone seems to know is they appeared on the doorsteps of many houses this morning. I am afraid many people took its information in the wrong light." "And nearly lit me up," Mab quipped as she crossed her arms over her chest and shook her head.
"I haven't been this close to being burned at the stake since," she frowned and sank into herself. "Well, since not long enough."
Also took his seat in his chair and swept his eyes over his company.
"All right, who wants to go first?"
Aunt Snoop was all smiles as she raised her hand.
"I'd be glad to go first, Chief Orso."
"It's about the rumor I heard, right?" He nodded.
"Yes."
"I'd like to know where you heard it."
"What rumor?"
I spoke up. "The rumor about the chosen one," Aunt Snoop told me. My eyebrow arched upward. "The what?" She rolled her eyes as though it was the most ridiculous question she'd ever heard. "The chosen one. The one who's supposed to save the whole valley."
"And where did you hear about this?"
Also questioned her.
"Well, last night at cards," she explained as she took a seat.
It was Susan Pryor's turn to host, so we all went up to her house, and that's when Mirabelle told us about her having a vision. You know how she goes on about those things, and said the town would be saved by the chosen one. "Mirabelle the Magnificent?" Orion asked her. She frowned up at him. "That is a very naughty name, Mr. John Huntley, and you know it."
"The Magnificent?"
I wondered. It's a rude name the boys thought up for Mirabelle when her predictions didn't turn out quite so accurate, Aunt Snoop huffed.
"She's never been right," Orion reminded her.
His aunt wagged a finger at him.
"But she's right now, John, and don't you deny it."
"Only a chosen one could get us out of this trouble, and that's for sure." I raised my hand.
"Not to remind people too much, but I'm sort of new here, so could somebody tell me what this chosen stuff is about?"
Aunt Snoop shrugged.
"I haven't the foggiest, but Mirabelle would know."
"I've got my men out searching for her. They should be back any time now," Orso spoke up. He picked up a pen and tapped the end of it against his desk as he shook his head. "Damn it, but I don't see how this mess could be the work of one person, especially with those warnings." Orion arched an eyebrow.
"What warnings?"
The chief leaned back in his chair and pursed his lip.
"Well, In addition to that flyer that's going around about you, Mab, the woman in question pursed her lips. Somebody stuck a couple of typed letters in people's newspapers that said that if the tree died, the town would be destroyed.
His gaze flickered to Aunt Snoop and his eyes narrowed. You wouldn't happen to know anything about that rumor, would you? She put her hands on her hips and glared at him. Do you think I'm the type to go around telling people something like that?
Do I have to answer that?
Aunt Snoop turned up her nose and spun on her heels so she faced away from him. Or so sighed. Anyway, whoever's spreading that one has a lot to answer for.
That's what most those calls out there are about.
Orion folded his arms across his chest and furrowed his brow. That explains why the mob was so anxious. I nodded. Yeah, nothing like the end of the world to get people excited about pitchforks and torches. The chief turned his attention to Sage.
That warning is why I called you here.
You wouldn't happen to be able to confirm or deny what the notes said, would you? Sage sighed. While the town would be unharmed should the tree die, there would be no newer creatures and no protection. He arched an eyebrow.
Protection from what?
The outside world. It is by the tree's power alone that keeps outsiders out except those in need of help, she explained. The chief kept his eyes on her but nodded at me. So she's one of the exceptions because why? Because she's the chosen one? Sage smiled at me. We believe so. All eyes fell on me. I frowned and held up my hands in front of me.
Wait a second here.
I'm just a simple reporter with some really bad luck. That's it. You were the first outsider to ever become a part of our community, Sage pointed out. And you have saved the town 3 times before.
So you're saying what?
That the tree brought me here to turn me into a werewolf, and give me a few test runs so I could save it? I guessed. She nodded. Exactly. I dropped one hand to my side, and ran the other through my hair.
This is nuts.
Orion perked up and pursed his lips.
Not as nuts as what's going on outside.
My ears picked up what he heard as soft shouts echoed through the front doors.
What the hell are those fools doing?
Also muttered as he jumped to his feet and strode from the room. Sage sidled up beside me and grasped my arm to lean close to my ear. He may need your help. I whipped my head to her and frowned. My help? Why my help? Orion made to follow also, but he paused in the doorway and turned to our group. He could use all of our help. If enough people get excited, we're going to have a runaway zoo on our hands. He hurried after the chief, and we women followed behind both of them. Also stalked through the front doors and out into the bright light of day with a dark cloud over the crowd. The people lifted their eyes to him as he appeared, and the shouting began. What's going on? A woman yelled. A man waved a small slip of paper the size of a note card above his head. Is it true about the tree? Also raised his hands and the crowd quieted. It is not true about the tree, so you can all go home now.
But who sent the cards? What's happening to the tree? That's what we'll figure out, but not if we have to spend all of our time answering your questions and phone calls, also pointed out.
A heavy-set man pushed his way to the forefront, and shoved the note card and a copy of the accusation slip against Mab in Orso's face.
There's something going on here, isn't there?
You're hiding something from us, aren't you? Orso pushed the man's hand away and frowned at him. We will tell you and everyone everything as soon as it is known. Now please disperse and go about.
No, the man argued.
He spun around to face the mob. We want to know now, don't we?
Yeah.
Right now. The man half turned and pointed a finger at Sage.
She can tell us.
Let her tell us. Sage shook her head. I can tell you nothing more than what Chief Orso.
The man growled.
I noticed a distinct brown fur push out from his arms, and curved buffalo horns poked out from atop his head. He whipped his head to Mab and snorted pungent air from his nostrils. You're in this together, aren't you? Also grabbed the man by the front of his coat, and pushed him away onto the sidewalk. Get on with you, Buffle. There's nothing, Buffle growled and rushed the chief. Also was half transformed when they collided in a tussle between beasts. They wrestled each other to the sidewalk, and rolled around as the mob erupted in angry shouts. Sides were taken and the fists, claws and paws came out. Stay here, Orion commanded me as he dove into the fight. I made to follow him, but I felt a hand on my shoulder. I glanced behind me and saw it was Sage. She smiled and nodded at the fight.
Tell them to cease their fighting.
I blinked at her. Come again. Her smile widened. Gather your confidence, and tell them to stop fighting. I pursed my lips and whipped my head back to the brawl. Orion and Orso had teamed up against the bellowing buffalo. A stork was fighting a pigeon. 2 stallions were chasing around a few dogs. Orso was right, this was a zoo, and I was already tired of watching the animals.
Knock it off,
I shouted. My voice rang out over the area, and hit the crowd as though I'd knocked them flat. They dropped to their hands and knees on the ground, all human and all puzzled as they unwilling shifted out of their forms. The people gawked at their human bodies, before their full attention fell on me. I gave a weak wave and smile before a sensation of fatigue hit me. That's when I lost consciousness. 11. The pain was less, that was the first thing I noticed. Also, the floor was very soft and slick. I creaked open my eyes, and found I lay on my right side on a blue leather couch. Spread out in front of me was a large square room. The lights were out, but some windows beyond my sight to my right allowed some natural light into the room. A desk sat to my right, and a door was set into the wall at my left. A couple of bookshelves sat against the wall opposite me. I was back in the mayor's office, the same place where I'd begun my strange journey into the citizenship of this even stranger town. I crossed one arm over my eyes and groaned. Please don't tell me I have to live that all over again. I muttered. I wouldn't mind, a voice spoke up. I dropped my arm and looked up. Orion sat beside me in the same wooden chair, with a gentle smile on his lips. You did a good job of scaring the hell out of me back there. I sat up and winced as a headache flared up inside my cranium.
What happened?
I asked him as I clutched my pounding head. He sat down beside me and looked me over. Your shout made everybody change back into their human form, and then you collapsed. Everyone was so amazed at what happened that Orso was able to disperse them. I snorted and dropped my hand. I really doubt I have the power to screech people out of their shifter forms. On the contrary, someone spoke up. I glanced at the door and found Sage standing in the doorway. Behind her stood Mab. They walked up to us and Sage smiled down at me. I believe the tree has granted you a gift, to soothe the hearts of the people. Can it soothe this headache? I muttered as I rubbed my head against the deep pounding ache. Orion looked up at her and frowned. This is connected to that chosen one business. She nodded. I believe so, but we cannot fully know the ways of the tree. I grunted as I climbed to my unsteady feet. Maybe it could learn to write on its leaves. Sage chuckled. Perhaps, but for now we must do what we can. This chosen one stuff rubs off in water, right? I don't have to keep dealing with massive headaches. I asked her. She shrugged. Who can say but? The tree. I get it. I turned to Orion. So what now? A mischievous smile slipped onto his lips. Don't look at me, you're the chosen one. I glared at him. Call me that again, and you'll be the chosen one on the couch tonight. He held up his hands. I'm not the enemy here. Time and the murderer are. I dropped my head and ran a hand through my hair. Sorry. I guess even thinking about being some sort of savior gets me edgy, like the weight of the world's on my shoulders. Or at least the weight of the hollow, Sage spoke up. But there is something I wish to discuss with you, her eyes flickered to Orion, both of you. It concerns the note placed in the newspapers. Orion arched an eyebrow.
The one you told Orso not to worry about?
She nodded. The same, and I did not lie to him, I merely omitted certain details.
That's just as bad as lying, I scolded her.
Sage pursed her lips but bowed her head. Unfortunately you are right, but I did not wish to add to his burden of troubles. The truth of the matter is, well, if the tree dies so do Sage and I, Mab spoke up. I glanced between the pair.
So why you guys and nobody else?
Sage sighed.
We the four of us have been in the town since its founding.
We were part of the original settlers. My eyes flickered up to Orion, but he merely nodded for her to continue. The tree chose us to guide the valley and its inhabitants, so that all would remain in peace. Then the letter about Mab was true, Orion surmised. Mab nodded. More or less, but I don't play favorites between the Amazons and the townspeople. In order for us to remain as leaders of the Hollow, the tree granted us some of its own life, Sage continued. That is why if the tree dies, our lives also will end. So if you guys die, then what'll happen to this place? I asked her. Mab closed her eyes and shook her head. Anarchy. I've lost count of how many times we've stopped everyone from killing each other. Sage nodded. Even the smallest squabbles were not beneath our notice, nor our attentions. So everything would still go to hell if the tree dies, I surmised. We believe so, Sage agreed. Orion folded his arms across his chest and furrowed his brow. Without the priestess, we'll have to assume the only person with the antidote is the poisoner. Maybe the priestess didn't give them the antidote, I pointed out. Would you be using a poison without its antidote? He asked me. I winced. Good point. Sage's gaze fell on me. So what will you do now, chosen one? My face drooped.
Let's just stick with Trixie, shall we?
And anyway, I don't know what to do next. I've got Troy's bath salts in the car, so I guess we'll take that to him before it gets broken in a riot or lynching. Sage shook her head. I am afraid that will prove rather difficult. Orion arched an eyebrow. Why? Because he seems to be missing. Both Orion and I started back. Missing? I repeated. Sage nodded. Yes. We can find him nowhere. I glanced up at Orion. Has he done this before? He shook his head. Never. He would not shirk his duties to his motel, unless something dire forced him to leave, Sage added. I returned my attention to her, and pursed my lips. You mean his caretaker duties, don't you? It was her turn to look startled. Mab frowned as she looked between us. How do you know about that? The priestess had in her possession a book titled The History of the Hollow, as compiled by the librarian, Orion told them. The two women glanced at each other before Sage returned her attention to us. If that is true, and I do not doubt your word, then you must see the librarian about this book. He will wish to know how it came to be outside the library. I shook my head. We don't know either. It was just lying in her bedroom. Then perhaps with his help you may be able to find out how it was taken, she persisted. I looked up at Orion. To the library? He shook his head. Not yet. There's somebody I want us to go see. Turkey Feather? Turkey Feather. Sage blinked at both of us. This is hardly the time for hunting. Orion smiled at her. Now's never been a better time. We'll tell you later if we. A knock came from the entrance. The door opened, and Orso took one step into the room. His lips were tightly pursed as he swept his eyes over our small company, before his gaze stopped on Orion. We found Mirabelle, the person your aunt said told her about the chosen one. Does she have anything else to add to it? Orion asked him. Orso scoffed. Worse than that, but you can talk to her for yourself. The chief led us back into the police department, and to his office. An older woman waited in a chair before the desk with her purse in her lap, and a frown on her lips. In one of her hands was a handkerchief. Beside her sat Aunt Snoop in an equally sour mood. The stranger glanced over her shoulder at us as we entered, and leapt to her feet. "I won't stay a minute longer around people who believe I'm a liar." Aunt Snoop whipped her head up and glared at her. "Because I saw you there, Mirabelle." "I wasn't." Mirabelle held up her handkerchief and sneezed into it. "I wasn't there." Orion stepped up to them, and held up his hands in front of each woman.
"Hold up.
What's going on?" His aunt nodded at her card partner.
"She says she wasn't at the card party last night."
"Because I wasn't," Mirabelle snapped as she let out a little sneeze.
"Why not?"
Orion asked her. Mirabelle straightened and pursed her lips. "This stupid spring thaw," another interruption with the handkerchief, "always makes me sneeze, and I knew if I accidentally," she paused for another sneeze, "sneezed on Susan's fine silk tablecloth I'd never be," the handkerchief was used again, "be invited back." I swept my eyes over the company.
"So who was there?"
Also dropped into his chair and pursed his lips.
"I don't know, but I'll have my men look into it.
If we find anything, we'll alert you. And keep us updated on the priestess," Orion reminded him before he turned to me. "We should probably leave before this gets any stranger." I nodded.
"Amen to that."
12. We left Aunt Snoop in the care of Sage, and walked to the back alley where the car awaited us. I slipped into the car, and pulled on my seat belt before I looked over at Orion.
"I don't know how this can get any weirder."
Troy missing, a murder, a dying tree, and a group of newshounds as our prime suspects. "Your prime suspects," he reminded me as he drove us out of the alley and onto the road. I crossed my arms over my chest and glared at him. "You have anybody better?" He sighed and shook his head.
"Not really."
"Then we're sticking with my theory. Besides, they had plenty of opportunity to put those notes about the tree in the papers."
"So did a lot of people," he pointed out.
"Even this turkey woman who lives outside town?" I reminded him. He shrugged.
"It's our best lead right now."
I leaned back in my seat and furrowed my brow.
"So how come we're going after only Abby, and not the whole flock?"
"Can't the rest of her family turn into turkeys?" "Most families do become the same animal, but there are exceptions," he explained. I glanced at him and arched an eyebrow.
"And the rest of her family is what?"
"Housecats." A snort escaped my nostrils.
Talk about adding insult to injury.
"So how mad was she when she became a turkey?"
"Mad enough that she attacked the tree."
"Only Armel's swift action saved it from losing a branch, and she was banished from the grove for life."
"That's a lot of motive to attack the tree, but is she the kind of person who'd actually go through with killing it and the priestess?"
I wondered. He shook his head. "Offhand I'd say no, but I would have said the same thing about Leto before he tried to murder you." I shook my head as a small smile slipped onto my lips.
"This is one crazy town."
"I would have been safer in the city." Orion's face fell a little, as his eyes flickered over to me. "Would you have been happier?" I leaned over and pecked a small kiss on his cheek.
"Don't worry.
This chosen one isn't going to abandon these crazy people, at least not until they pull their pitchforks out on me." He grinned. "Good. Now let's see what trouble we can get into out on the farm." We drove 10 miles out of town, and down a long dirt driveway before we reached the Tercia farm. The driveway was flanked on either side by fields of hay, just waking up from their winter slumber. At the end of the dirt was a large circle. The 2-floor farmhouse stood on the right, and across from it was a picturesque barn complete with a steep red roof and a pair of large wood doors. On the other side was a chicken coop surrounded by a tall wire fence, through which we could see the little hens peck away at the ground. Orion parked the car in front of the house and we stepped out. A wide porch ran along the whole front of the house, and on the porch railing sat a bright calico cat cleaning itself. Its eyes flickered in our direction, but it didn't cease the bathing of its tail. Movement to my right made me look in that direction. A small brown-haired mouse ran away from me and slipped under the porch. I glanced at the cat and scoffed.
I think the security around here is getting lax.
The door opened, and out stepped a short woman in a blue dress and apron. She had blonde hair that was bundled into a bun atop the back of her head. Her eyes were a dark brown, and her face was thin and beaked. She would have looked ill-tempered if she hadn't greeted us with a wide open smile.
Welcome.
Welcome, she chanted as she met us at the steps that led onto the porch. She set one hand against one of the upright posts and looked between us.
What can I do for you? Sorry to come so early, Miss Tercia, Orion began.
Abby, if you please, she interrupted.
Well, Abby, we wanted to ask you something, Orion told her.
Abby leaned forward and squinted as she studied Orion's face. Don't I know you? Orion pressed his fist against his lips and cleared his throat.
Well, I don't know if you remember me, but when your dad operated the farm, he hired out the mechanical duties to some young.
Abby started back and pointed a finger at him.
You're one of those boys that broke up that tractor engine.
He sheepishly smiled.
Well, I wouldn't put it that way. That's the way Pa put it, and the sheriff, she returned.
I arched an eyebrow, and my eyes flickered to Orion. The sheriff? I thought you said you and your friends were working on it. He shrugged.
Well, we were, but we really didn't know what we were doing.
Abby slapped her knee as she let out a barking laugh.
But that's not what you told Pa, and boy was he mad when you blew up his tractor.
Said he'd get the money out of your hides. She paused and tilted her head up as she furrowed her brow.
Well, if he could have caught any of you, that is.
You all scrammed so fast we thought you'd all turned into cheaters. Except for that one young fellow. Tom? Bob? Orion grinned.
That was Bill also.
I rolled my eyes.
Why am I not surprised?
Abby nodded.
Yep, that was him.
Anyway, I think Pa got the money out of you boys from your parents, and all's well that ends well, as he always used to say. Orion winced and rubbed his behind.
Yeah.
They got the money off our hides. I raised my hand.
Not that this isn't hilarious to hear, but could we focus?
The humor dropped from Orion's face, as he reached into his coat and drew out the turkey feather. We wanted to ask you about this, Abby. Is it one of yours? Abby took it and turned it over, as a frown developed on her lips. She opened her fingers, and let it drift to the ground where it joined a few chicken feathers.
Yeah, but what about it? We found it in the swamp, he told her.
She wrinkled her nose. The swamp? What in the world was it doing there? We were hoping you could tell us, I spoke up. She shook her head.
Nope, not a clue.
Mind you, these damn things, she kicked the feather with the tip of her boot, get everywhere. Especially when I'm molting.
It's absolutely disgusting.
I whipped my head left and right. The voice was that of a woman, but there was nobody around, except for we three and the cat. The cat still sat on the railing, but it had stopped its cleaning, and was watching us with a deep frown. I leaned backward toward Orion, and pointed at the cat. Did that feline just talk? The end of the cat's tail twitched and it spoke again.
This feline can talk, and very well, thank you.
I blinked at the talking cat. Orion? Mind explaining this to me? It's a unique ability to change oneself fully into their special animal, he explained to me. The cat raised its head and its frown changed to a smirk. One at which our family excels. Abby folded her arms over her chest and rolled her eyes. Lucky us. The feline sauntered over to us, and leaned its side against the upright post. I also teach this skill, if you so desire.
They're not here for one of your overpriced stupid lessons, Abby scolded her.
The tip of the feline's tail twitched. They're not overpriced, and you know I don't even charge family members. Abby turned away and crossed her arms over her chest.
You charge me, she muttered.
I pointed at the cat. So you're who? The cat plopped its reed down and puffed out its chest. I am Tabitha Tercia, older sister to her, she nodded at Abby, and teacher of the family skill of full transformation. We thank you for your offer, but we came here to ask your sister how her feather might have been found in the swamp, Orion told her. Abby glanced over her shoulder at us and shrugged. I have no idea. Maybe the wind blew it there. Tabitha scoffed. The swamp is miles away, and that feather they brought was fresh. I could smell it.
What's it matter that it was there, anyway?
Abby counted.
The priestess was murdered.
Your feather was found near her home, Orion explained. The color drained from Abby's face. Murdered? Killed? Orion nodded.
Yes.
We were wondering where you were last night. Abby turned to us and pressed her palm against her chest. The police don't think I did it, do they?
They don't know about the feather, I spoke up. We're the ones who found it. Where were you last night at about 1?
Orion persisted. Abby trembled with fear, and I detected faint hints of feathers poking out from her skin.
I.
Tabitha rolled her eyes and sighed. Control yourself, sister. I can vouch for you. Abby whipped her head to her sibling, and her mouth dropped open. Tabitha's bright eyes fell on us. She was asleep all night from 9 until 6.
How do you know that?
I asked her. She was snoring so loud, I could hardly get any mouse hunting done. Those damn things destroy our chicken eggs if they're not taken care of nightly, she explained. Tabby! Abby cried out as she rushed her sister, and wrapped her arms tightly around the small feline. Tears streamed down Abby's face as she hugged the cat to her chest.
I didn't know you cared.
Tabitha squirmed in the tight hold. Let go or I won't do it again, she gasped. Abby released her sister, and stepped back to smile at her frazzle-furred sister. You're a lifesaver. Tabitha wrapped her tail around herself and glared at her sibling.
Now look what you've done.
I'll have to bath all over again. Abby snapped her fingers. I know, I'm going to go get you some warm milk. She rushed inside to fetch the treat. Tabitha's ears perked up, and I detected a hint of drool at the corners of her lips. She glanced at us and cleared her throat. It sounded like a hairball, about to come out.
Yes, well, did you need anything else?
Orion shook his head. No. Thanks for the help. We walked back to the car, and slipped inside just as Abby hurried out with a saucer of milk. She proudly laid it before her sister, who just as eagerly lapped up the treat. I glanced over at Orion, as he started the car.
Looks like this was a red herring.
He stared ahead and pursed his lips. Maybe. We'll go see if the librarian can explain that book you found. 13. We drove up to the library, or what remained of it, and stepped out to behold the damage in full daylight. The front wall was a mess of charcoal made to look like studs and beams. Through the blackened remains, we could see many water and fire-damaged bookshelves, now empty of their books. The librarian had the damaged books orderly stacked against the far wall, and we found him perusing over them with pencil and pad. Destroyed, destroyed, damaged, destroyed, he muttered to himself as he wrote down on his pad the book title and its health update. Orion and I stopped behind him, as he knelt before a pile of the ruined tomes. He didn't so much as pause in his cataloguing. We need to ask you something, I spoke up. Ask and ye shall receive an answer, the librarian muttered as he continued his work.
Was there any damage to the forbidden section?
Orion asked him. Of course not. That section is well sealed, the librarian assured him. He paused in his book perusing, and glanced over his shoulder at us with narrowed eyes.
Why do you ask?
I held up the history tome. Because we found this at the... A swift intake of breath from the usually stoic old man made me pause. The librarian spun around and snatched the book from my hand. He brushed his hand over the cover before he opened it, and flipped through the pages. After a quick perusal, he slammed the cover shut and looked up at us with hard eyes.
Where did you find this?
I was going to tell you that we found it at the priestess's house, I finished. The librarian frowned. Who brought it there? I shrugged.
No idea.
We were hoping you could tell us. He glanced down at the book and shook his head. I cannot tell you what I do not know. This book, he lifted his head to match our curious gazes and raised the book up, this was never to leave the library. If that's the case, could we see where it was stored? Orion asked him. The librarian pursed his lips but nodded.
Yes, but you must swear never to reveal what you see down there.
I nodded at the tome he'd snatched from me. I'm pretty sure somebody else has already broken that promise.
Swear it, he hissed.
I glanced at Orion. He nodded, so we both returned our attention to the librarian.
We swear it, we spoke together.
The librarian set his pencil and pad atop the stacks, and tucked the tome under his arm. This way. He led us to the door I'd seen on that fateful bombing night, the one marked Forbidden Section. The librarian removed a chain from his vest coat, and attached to it were two ancient metal keys worn smooth with age. He unlocked the thick lock with one of the keys, and swung the door into the room to reveal a small landing and a staircase of carved rock steps that ran down to our left. The librarian stepped inside and gestured for us to follow. Come on. We do not have all the time in the world. We slipped inside, and the librarian tightly shut the door behind us. He guided us down the stairs to the bottom some 20 feet below the library floor, and with the ceiling even with the ground outside. At the bottom stood a heavy wooden door with an equally heavy lock. The other key unlocked that door, and he stepped just inside the door to light an old oil lamp that hung near the doorway. Come in. Come in, he snapped. We slipped inside, and he shut the door behind us, allowing the clang of the heavy lock to echo through the long room in which we found ourselves. The basement was carved from soft stone and ran for 50 feet. It was 40 feet wide, and that space was filled with long rows of bookshelves. Leather-bound tomes and fresh paperbacks, rubbed spines together in a catalogued arrangement of category, author and title. The librarian lit another lamp that hung on the end of the farthest row of bookcases to the left, and hurried down the aisle. We followed and met him where he stopped before a shelf of books bound in hides. An empty spot denoted a missing book. The librarian pursed his lips. How could this be? Did anyone ask to see it? Orion asked him. The librarian shook his head. No, nor would anyone, because no one but myself and very few others know of its existence.
Somebody must have known or suspected, I commented as I wandered back down the aisle.
That is impossible. Even if there was some possibility, they could not have entered this room without my keys, and I have never let them from my sight, he insisted. I paused before a shelf full of books of more recent vintage. Many of them were paperbacks, but a few were bound in brown covers. I squinted as I read off the titles. Tom Sawyer. Huck Finn. I glanced down at the pair of men. These books look new. The librarian looked in my direction and frowned. Many of those are first editions, and some are copies for the use of the patrons, and I would prefer you not touch them. I returned my attention to the books and wrinkled my nose. Why would you want a first copy or any copy of Mice and Men? It is a classic, and though the hollow is isolated, we are not heathens, the librarian snapped as he turned his attention to Orion. However, we must return to the important matter at hand. As I said before, there is no other way in this room, except through those doors. I'll search the room, Orion offered before he strode further down the aisle. Noticing the attentions of my two companions was turned away, I took one of the older-looking mouse books down, and opened the cover to look for a copyright. A scent hit my nose that made me gag so badly that I dropped the book. The librarian marched over to me, and snatched the book from the floor before he wagged it in my face. Miss Lyle, this is a priceless. Pain in the nose, I finished as I clapped my hand over my wounded nostrils. The librarian puffed out his chest like a ruffled hen. "That is the scent of an old book, Miss Lyle." Orion strode over to us and took the book from the librarian. He took a whiff and frowned.
"It smells like mouse droppings."
He held out his hand to the bookkeeper.
"Let me see it."
The librarian frowned, but handed the book over. We two crowded around him as Orion opened the cover and flipped to the center of the book. All our eyes widened as we beheld a hollowed-out area in the book. A pile of old mouse droppings lay in the chewed pages, along with a small greenish ball. The librarian's mouth flapped open and shut.
What has happened here?"
Orion picked up the ball and sniffed. "Cheese. Judging from the molded and hardened state, I'd say it's been in here for over a year." I plucked a small brown-colored hair from the book and furrowed my brow.
"This looks familiar."
"A typical color for mice and no doubt filthy," the librarian snapped. Our scholarly companion wrenched the book from Orion's hands and flipped the pages to the back, where an old-fashioned checkout card lay nestled in its pouch. On the short lines were written a few names. The last name was that of a Sarah Herring. The date on the card was one from the previous year. The librarian frowned at the name. "Miss Herring has a great deal to answer for." "Who is she?" I asked him. "A young lady in the 10th grade, whom I entrusted with these precious pages of knowledge," he growled. Orion shook his head.
"She couldn't have done this."
He pointed at the rough edges of the hollowed-out pages. "A real mouse chewed this nest and stayed in it."
"But where's the mouse?"
I asked him. He leaned back and glanced down the aisle at the door. "Can this room be unlocked from the inside?" The librarian shook his head.
"No, but what does that matter?"
My eyes widened. Maybe because the mouse wasn't a mouse. I glanced at the door. The bottom was 3 inches above the floor. Maybe a small mouse might have pushed a book under there. Orion nodded.
"Yes.
It was one of us, transformed into a full mouse, who hid in this book and stole the history of the Hollow. And there's only one person who'd know who might have done it, right?" I guessed. "Tabitha Tercia." Orion snatched the book back from the librarian, grabbed my hand and pulled me toward the door. "We need to borrow this for a while." "But bring it back and on time," the librarian demanded as I was dragged up the stairs. Orion pulled me to the car, and we dropped into our seats. He tossed the book into my lap and sped out of the parking lot. I clutched the book against my chest and grabbed the handle above the door with my other hand.
"This isn't a matter of life and death,"
I snapped at him. "It might be a matter of life," he argued as we flew up the hill that led out of town and into the countryside.
"Not ours if you keep going at this speed." "But maybe Tabitha Tercia's," he argued.
I whipped my head to him. "Say what?" "If the priestess was killed because she knew the poisoner, then the same might happen to Tabitha for knowing who can change into their full form," he pointed out. I cringed and settled into his suicidal speed, with anxiety that we would either never reach there alive, or reach the house to find someone else wasn't alive. The possibility of our deaths was averted a mile away from the Tercia driveway, when flashing red and blue lights appeared in the rear view mirror. Orion pursed his lips, but pulled over to the side of the road. The cop car, however, flew past us and took a sharp left onto the dirt driveway. Orion skidded onto the road and sped after them. We bumped along the dirt road and reached the front of the farmhouse as the officers stepped out. One of them was Officer Danny, and the other was our old friend Scott Ambigo, the police detective who'd helped us on our last murder case. We parked beside their vehicle and got out. Orion's eyes fell on the detective. "Why is also having his detectives make house calls?" "Also thought I should follow you since it's murder now, but then this call came up and we had to respond," Ambigo told us. At that moment, the door flew open and slammed against the outer wall. Abby flew out of the house and down the stairs, where she grabbed onto the front of Ambigo's coat. Her face was red and soaked with tears.
Please help me.
You have to help me. He grabbed her hands and nodded.
Of course, but what's the problem?
Dispatch said there was something about her missing.
She's not missing.
Something's happened to her. Abby shrieked. Happened to who? I spoke up. She whipped her head to me. My sister.
Tell us what happened, Ambigo soothed.
Abby shook her head.
I don't hiccup now.
I came out here to pick up her saucer, and heard this terrible screech. I can't even say where it came from. I heard something flutter out the back of the barn, so I looked in there, but I couldn't find her. I looked to Orion.
Can't we just sniff her out?
He shook his head.
Her scent is everywhere.
We'd be following the tracks for hours. Ambigo set Abby down on the top step, and patted one of her hands. You stay here and keep an eye out for her while we search. He straightened and turned to Officer Danny and us. We'll search the grounds first, including the barn, and then go for the house. We all nodded, and broke up to search the grounds separately. Officer Danny took the area around the house, while we three went for the barn and its chicken coop extension. Ambigo slipped around the perimeter, while Orion flung open one of the barn doors, and hurried inside with me at his heels. The barn was dimly lit, but there were enough gaps between the boards for our wolf eyes to see clearly. There were 2 lofts on either side of the central area, and beneath them were empty stables. Orion went for a ladder on the left, that led up to the loft. I took a few steps inside when a sound came to my ears. It was as soft as the patter of bare feet on carpet, but the sound was unmistakable. It was the mewing of a small cat. Orion! I shouted as I rushed forward. There came another mew, softer now. I cupped my hands over my mouth. Tabby! Tabby! Here, kitty kitty! Orion hurried to my side, and looked from me to the barn around us. Do you? I pressed my finger to my lips. The faintest noise, more like a rustle, came to my ears. I rushed forward to the rear and the right-hand stall. Orion was at my heels, as I flung open the rusty stable door and looked inside. The floor was made of dirt, and littered with old rusted machinery and broken milking buckets. Orion rushed past me, and lunged at the farthest corner against the exterior wall. He tossed aside the garbage, until he revealed a small round hole in the wall. The limp leg of a cat peeked out. 14. Tabby! I whispered as Orion reached inside. He gingerly drew out Tabitha, cradled in his palms, and set her down on the floor. Her beautiful orange fur was marred with red blood. The life fluid came from several long gashes that followed the length of her body. She didn't move, as Orion set her down on the floor before him. I swallowed the lump in my throat. Is she? Orion shook his head.
She's not dead, but she's badly hurt.
He lifted his head, and looked at the exterior wall. Ambigo! In here! In a moment Ambigo rushed through the front doors and hurried over to us. He paused in the stall doorway and swept his gaze over the scene. His eyes fell on the gravely injured cat. Good God!
Not if we don't act quickly, Orion told him.
Danny! Ambigo called out, before he joined Orion on the ground beside the cat. How is she?
She's pretty badly hurt, Orion commented.
He glanced in my direction and studied me.
How did you know she was here?
I blinked at him. You must have heard her meowing. He pursed his lips as he looked down at the injured cat.
I didn't hear anything.
Ambigo shook his head. Neither did I, and in the state she's in I doubt she could have uttered even a weak meow. He whipped his head up to Officer Danny, as the policeman ran up to us. Call an ambulance, and tell them it's a cat that's in trouble. The officer nodded, and hurried away to the patrol car. Ambigo returned his attention to the victim. He studied the gashes before he pursed his lips. These came from a large bird. His eyes flickered up to Orion. Do you agree? Orion nodded.
Yeah.
The long thin lacerations prove that. I looked between the men and frowned. You're not seriously suggesting Abby did it, are you? Don't rule out any possibilities, Ambigo scolded me as he drew off his coat and started to tear it into pieces. He wrapped the worst of the wounds in this strips.
That should stop the bleeding, but she's lost a lot of blood already.
Tabitha took a deep breath that made her tiny body shudder. Her eyes fluttered open and brushed over us. She made to stand, but the pair of men pressed light against her body and pinned her to the ground. Stay still, Ambigo whispered to her. Can you tell us who did this to you? Orion spoke up. Tabitha swallowed hard.
It was. She shut her eyes and clenched her teeth.
Ambigo set his hand on her shoulder.
Don't strain yourself.
She opened her eyes, but some of their former consciousness was gone. Her voice was a mere wisp of air. Ward, her head fell back and her eyes closed. Tabitha, came a shriek from behind us. We whipped our heads back to see Abby, standing in the stall door. She had her mouth covered with one hand, and her wide eyes gazed down at her sister in horror. Officer Danny came up behind her, and glanced at Ambigo. The ambulance is on its way. It should be here in 5 minutes. Ambigo stood, and walked over to Abby. He grasped her shoulders and tried to guide her backward.
You shouldn't see this, Miss Tercia.
Abby twisted in his hold, as she tried to look past him at her wounded sibling.
What happened?
Why does she look like that?
Someone attacked her, he explained as he led her away.
She whipped her head up and gawked at him. Attacked her? Who? Why? He shook his head. We don't know, but we'll do everything we can for her. He glanced over his shoulder at me. Miss Lyle, could you please take her back to the house?
No.
Please let me stay with my sister. Abby shrieked as she thrashed in his hold. I leapt to my feet, and hurried over to them, as Ambigo tried to hand her to Officer Danny. This is a crime scene, Miss Tercia, and you must leave. Ambigo commanded her. I grabbed her shoulders and glared at the men as Abby clung to me. Crime scene or no crime scene, at least be a little more gentle with packing her off like she was a bunch of old newspapers. Ambigo's eyes flickered down to Abby, before he nodded at the open barn door. Would you please take her out? She's about to. Abby went limp in my arms and the unexpected weight dragged both of us to the floor. A little help, I gasped. A small smile touched the corners of Orion's lips, as he hurried over and swept Abby into his arms. You have to remember you're a werewolf, he scolded me as he strode toward the door. I frowned but hurried after him. A square of light on the floor near the door made me pause and look over my shoulder. A small square window was the only means of escape, other than the front door and those of the stalls. Its hinged door swung slowly to and fro against a slight breeze. I pursed my lips, but quickly followed Orion and his load to the house. There was a small rocking chair on the porch in which he laid her. Her eyes fluttered open, and widened when they beheld our faces. Tabby. Where is she? She tried to sit up, but I grabbed her shoulders and pressed her down. If you don't calm down, you might both be carted off in the ambulance, I scolded her. She whipped her head to me and frowned.
I just want to be with my sister.
Why won't anyone let me do that? Because you and your sister weren't on very good terms, Orion spoke up. I glared up at him.
Not a good time, I growled.
Abby's eyes widened and flickered between us. You think I did this to her? I sighed and jerked my head towards Orion. He might, and Ambigo, though he probably just wants a clean crime scene. Don't rule anyone out, Orion scolded me. Abby turned her face away and pursed her lips. I know we don't act much like it, but I couldn't hurt her, not like, she looked at her lap and shuddered, not like that. I knelt in front of her and smiled. Do you know anyone who would want to do that to her? Abby shook her head. No. She didn't have that many friends, and even fewer enemies. What about some of her former students? Orion asked her. She lifted her head and furrowed her brow as she looked at him. I suppose some of the people who couldn't do it might have been mad at her, but you make it sound like you know who it is.
More like what? I spoke up.
We think it's someone who could turn themselves into a mouse. Abby shook her head.
But how could a mouse do that to her? That's what we're trying to find out. So is there someone who fits that description?
Orion wondered. She shook her head.
I don't know.
I didn't always see who was taking lessons, and she never let me look at the list.
List?
I asked her. Abby nodded.
Yeah.
She kept a list of everyone she taught. Do you know where it is? Orion inquired. She pointed a finger upward.
I think it's in her room, but I don't know where. Show us and maybe we can find it, I pleaded.
She nodded and led us inside to the second floor. We reached the room, the one that occupied the farthest east wing of the house, and went inside. Tabitha's bedroom was neat but quaint, with a quilt on the small bed and a picturesque old roller-top desk against the table to our left. Orion stepped inside and turned to Abby, who stood beside me just inside the doorway. Do you know what it looks like? Abby bit her lower lip as she swept her eyes over the room. They widened when her gaze fell on the open desk. She hurried over and grabbed a small book from the top before she turned to us. This is it. This is her book. Orion strode over and took it from her. He flipped through the pages. It looks like she wrote down their names, payments, and their animal, but not whether they succeeded or not. She didn't want to embarrass anybody who couldn't do it. It isn't easy to do, and most people outside our family don't succeed, Abby explained. I furrowed my brow as I inspected the neat room.
It doesn't look like anybody tried to search for it.
Orion paused and glanced over his shoulder at the room. His eyebrows crashed down. You're right. It's almost as if they didn't try to look for it. A siren was heard in the distance. Abby ran to one of the windows and flung it open. The loud wail of an ambulance was heard coming up the driveway. She spun around to face us.
Please let me go with my sister.
Please. Orion pursed his lips but held up the book.
Are all the names of your sister's pupils in here?
She nodded. All of them. Then we'll vouch for you. That should be enough for Ambigo, Orion assured her. A wide grin spread across her lips. Thank you. Thank you so much. I stretched my arm across her upper back and drew her toward the door. Don't thank us until you're in that ambulance. 15. We hurried downstairs and onto the porch. The ambulance was parked at the barn, and we saw the two paramedics bring out a small stretcher. On the stretcher lay Tabitha. Wait! Abby yelled as she rushed down the steps and across the yard to the ambulance. Ambigo stepped out of the barn and frowned at her. Miss Tercia, I must ask.
It's fine, Orion spoke up as he and I joined them. She can go with her sister.
Ambigo arched an eyebrow, but his eyes flickered to Abby. She clutched her hands in front of her, staring unblinkingly at him. He sighed and jerked his head toward the open ambulance doors. Get in. Abby nodded and climbed into the cramped quarters. She sat down and turned to us with a smile. If you ever need my help, just ask. The doors were shut, and the ambulance sped off down the driveway. Ambigo turned to us. So, are you going to tell me what makes you think she didn't do it? Orion held up the book.
She helped us find this.
It's the list of all the students Tabitha Tercia ever taught. Ambigo took the book and flipped through the pages. How does this prove her innocence, and who the guilty party is? We followed a trail here that led to one of the students of Tabitha Tercia, Orion told him. And? Ambigo asked him. Orion shook his head.
We don't know who it is.
As you can see that book, he nodded at the notebook in Ambigo's hand, she's had a lot of students.
But how many were successful in learning the transformation?
Ambigo wondered. Only Tabitha can answer that, Orion replied. Ambigo pursed his lips. And she may not be speaking to us anytime soon, or maybe never if those wounds become infected. He sighed and shook his head.
This is like looking into a muddy puddle.
He furrowed his brow, and his eyes flickered up to us.
Why were you looking into one of the students? That falls under detective-client privilege, I answered. That doesn't work when there's murder involved, he countered.
Orion took back the book from Ambigo, looped his arm through one of mine, and smiled at the detective. We'll call you or also if we learn anything. Ambigo's hand whipped out and grabbed my wrist as he shook his head. This isn't one of your hunts, Orion. This is a murder investigation, and I'm going to have to insist you tell me everything you know. Orion yanked me toward him, but didn't break Ambigo's hold on my wrist.
We'll tell you everything when we have everything.
Ambigo pulled me toward him and shook his head. If you won't cooperate, then I'll have to insist you come down to the station with me. Another yank from Orion. You'd understand the secrecy if you knew who our clients were. It was Ambigo's turn.
Then tell me.
Pull.
We're wasting time.
Tug.
Then we'll waste it down at the station.
Guys. I yelped as I wrenched myself from their game of tug-of-war. I rubbed my aching arms and glared at both of them. Seriously, grow up. This is serious, Ambigo insisted. I turned to him and poked a finger into his chest.
Don't you think we know that?
Don't you think we've been risking our necks for the last 12 hours? Trixie, Orion spoke up. I glanced over my shoulder at him.
What?
His eyes lay on Ambigo, and he nodded at him.
Something's happening to him.
I returned my attention to the detective, and furrowed my brow. Ambigo's eyes were wide open, and stared down at me with a calming fog over his eyes. I followed his chest down to where my finger pushed against his front. I drew my hand away. Ambigo shook his head, and the calm expression vanished. His eyes flickered between us as he pursed his lips. I understand you're both trying to help, but we need to work together on this.
Touch him again, Orion commanded me.
I whipped my head to him and frowned. Do what? Ambigo frowned.
What are you talking about?
Grab him and tell him to leave us alone, Orion insisted. Ambigo drew a gun from inside his coat.
I'm sorry to have to do this, but you? I grabbed his arm.
He stiffened, and the gun clattered to the ground. The same foggy look reappeared in his eyes. I licked my lips. Don't you have to believe us when we say we're on your side, okay? We just need a little more time to get this figured out. His face contorted, as though he was trying to wrestle with his inner self. I shook his arm. Please. Orion took a step forward, and solved his dilemma with a quick right punch to the face. Ambigo crumpled to the ground and didn't stir.
You didn't have to do that.
I scolded Orion, as I knelt beside the fallen detective. Hey, a voice yelled. We'd forgotten about Officer Danny, who hurried out of the barn toward us. Orion grabbed my hand and pulled me to the car. We slid into our seats, and Orion spun the car around and drove us down the driveway.
Stop! The officer shouted as he drew his gun.
I ducked down as bullets hit the rear. The car bounced onto the hard pavement, and we turned down the road that led away from town. I raised my head and glared at Orion.
What the hell are you doing?
We're going to get arrested. We were going to, anyway, he argued as he stepped on the gas. We flew down the road as fast as the old car would allow us. I was convincing him. I counted. His eyes flickered to me. Do you even know what and how you're doing that? I opened my mouth but froze.
You're right,
I muttered as I slid down in my seat and stared at my feet. I raised one hand and studied the upturned palm.
What the hell is going on?
First the zombies, then the crowd, and now I'm brainwashing people. I balled my hand into a fist and frowned. It all started after I touched that leaf Sage gave me. Do you still have it? Orion asked me. I shook my head.
No, it's at the house.
Orion pursed his lips and glanced out the window.
Then we'll have to ask Sage about it.
I snorted.
If we don't get thrown into jail first.
What would the charges be? Assaulting an officer, refusing arrest, concealing evidence. At this rate, I'll have a rap sheet longer than my arm in no time. I crossed my arms over my chest and frowned. If you were going to get us into this mess, we could at least go rob a bank. The corners of his mouth twitched up.
I have a hideout we can stay at for a while until things cool down.
I glanced at him with an arched eyebrow. Seriously? He slowed the car and turned off onto a bumpy road mostly hidden by brush and small trees. Their branches whacked at the car as I bounced in my seat. I clutched the door and glared at him.
Are we supposed to get there in one piece?
Mostly, but wait until you see my hideout. 16. I looked over the abandoned chicken coop with apprehension. We stood in the middle of the forest a few miles northwest of town. The car was hidden a mile off the road, beneath the boughs of a giant evergreen pine tree. The chicken coop, hidden deep in the forest, leaned to one side. Dead weeds 5 feet high climbed the cracked clapboard walls. A stone foundation of a long-gone house stood nearby. I turned to Orion, who stood beside me, and gestured to the ancient roost. Seriously? Would you rather have a cell? He countered. Do they come with pillows?
No.
I turned back to the coop and sighed.
Then I guess I'd better learn to cluck.
Orion led the way through the half-rotted door. I stopped in the doorway and blinked. Before me was a small room with old but clean furnishings. There was a fold-out couch, a table, and on the table was a propane lantern. A pair of chairs flanked the couch, and on them were clean blankets and pillows. The floor was swept clean, and the interior of the ceiling and walls were boarded up to keep out the cold. A hefty cloth bag lay on the floor beside one of the chairs. I guess I'll know where you're at if you ever run away from me, I quipped. Orion plopped himself down on the couch and grinned up at me.
That's how I found this place.
Your mom tried to make you eat vegetables? I asked him as I sat down beside him. He shook his head. No, she wouldn't give me a bigger allowance, so I thought I'd run away and get some work. I got this far when night fell, and scared me so bad I hid in here until the next morning. Then I ran back. Did she give you the bigger allowance? I asked him. He laughed. No, but she didn't give me a beating and then hugged me. I leaned back and curled my legs against my chest. So, are we just waiting for tomorrow morning to run back to the police station, or do you have a plan? The humor fled from his face as he shook his head.
I'm not really sure, but I knew we couldn't solve this from the inside of a cell.
We could have told Ambigo about everything, I pointed out. Orion pursed his lips. A client is a client, and I never reveal their identity unless they give me permission. I held up my hand. All right, Boy Scout, since detective work is your forte, what do we do now? We go over the facts and figure out where the trail leads next, he told me. I snorted.
Probably to another murder.
Tabitha's still alive, he reminded me. But we've got a voodoo priestess wandering the swamps now, I countered, as I leaned back against the couch and ran a hand through my hair. If this keeps up, there's not going to be anyone left alive in the hollow for our suspects to sell papers to.
Your suspects, he reminded me.
I rolled my eyes. Come on, they've got the most to gain from this with paper circulation. And just as much to lose as anyone else, he pointed out. I pursed my lips.
Well, I guess whoever tried to frame Abby for the murder of the priestess was relying on their lack of sisterly love to frame her for the attempted one on Tabitha.
Orion nodded.
That's likely, but unfortunately it's no secret that the sisters weren't fond of each other.
I held up the notebook.
How many people do you think knew about this?
Orion shrugged. Maybe all of the students, maybe none. I pursed my lips and shook my head. Why do I get the feeling we're going around in circles, when the evidence is staring us in the face?
That's if the murderer left some clues, Orion pointed out as he tossed me a bag of potato chips from the cloth bag.
The expiration date caught my attention. My eyes flickered up to him. This bag expired 5 years ago. He was happily munching away on his own expired bag.
What's your point?
I rolled my eyes and glanced down apprehensively at the food. On the front was the usual ad gimmick of, family owned and operated since before you were born. I froze as a thought hit me. Orion?
Yeah.
Didn't Tabitha say she didn't charge family members for her services? He arched an eyebrow.
Yeah, why?
I held up the book.
So they wouldn't be in here, would they?
So they'd be the last ones to know about this book, and want to steal it to hide their identity. His eyes widened as a grin slid onto my lips. And who also has the strange distinction of having a lot of different animals in the family, including a mouse. He sat up and looked me in the eyes.
The Parsons family has that distinction.
And are they related? He pursed his lips and nodded.
Yeah.
The mother of the Tercia sisters was the sister to Myrtle Parsons. Matriarch of the Paper family, I finished with my chest puffed out and a grin on my lips. Orion shook his head.
That doesn't prove they did it, only that they had the opportunity.
A lot of other people had the opportunity. Maybe, but you're forgetting about that mouse in the library book, I reminded him. He munched on another chip. That does point to Luella being in that book in the library, but how did she get in there when the book was checked out by a 10th grader, he pointed out. I furrowed my brow.
Yeah.
Somehow they must have. My eyes widened and I snapped my fingers.
That's it?
A 10th grader. The what? Orion asked me. I turned in my seat to face him. You told me that 9th graders were allowed to be cub reporters, right? He nodded. Then that girl might have been a cub reporter last year when she checked out that book. Maybe they even told her to check it out for research purposes, or some other excuse like that.
But what about the murder of the priestess? He countered.
I frowned. What about it? They obviously framed Abby for it. Can you prove they were ever there, other than the book? He wondered. I leaned back and furrowed my brow.
They had to have messed up somewhere, or that priestess was a real idiot for trusting the priestess.
I whipped my head to Orion. Remember that piece of furniture she was bumping into, after she turned into a zombie? He nodded.
Now, I remember what it was called.
It was a wine and cheese buffet. Cheese as in mouse. Orion paused with a chip suspended in front of his open mouth. He clacked his mouth shut and frowned.
All right, that's a lot of evidence.
A lot of evidence? I repeated.
That's a hell of a lot of evidence.
I raised one hand with my fingers outstretched. They're family to the Tercia clan. They have the unique gift to transform fully into their animals. They had that girl as a reporter to get Luella inside the book, to get into the library, looking for evidence their family's been wanting for nearly as long as this family's been around.
But what's their motive for attacking the tree? He asked me.
I dropped my well-used hand and furrowed my brow.
Well, like you said earlier, maybe they didn't like what they found in that library book.
I mean, they did try to blow us all up, and then there's the rumors about Mab running around town. A dark cloud fell on Orion's brow, as he stared hard at his open potato chip bag in his lap. Sage. He lifted his gaze to mine. If the tree dies, so will Sage. I frowned.
This is bad.
If they've attacked the librarian Mab, and are trying to attack Sage through the tree, then that means... Troy. Orion exclaimed as he leapt to his feet.
They must have kidnapped him to kill.
I jumped up and put my hands on my chest. Easy there. I'm the one who's supposed to be emotional, remember? Besides, he's a wily old guy. Maybe he already figured out most of this stuff and… We both jumped a foot in the air when a ringing phone went off in the small chicken coop. Orion pulled out his ringing phone and frowned at the screen.
How are you even getting signal out here?
I asked him. He shook his head.
There isn't any signal.
I arched an eyebrow.
So how is it getting through?
I don't know. He pressed the accept button and put the phone against his ear. Hello. I heard the faint sound of a voice on the other end. Orion frowned.
We're in a tight spot, miss, the voice spoke again.
He pursed his lips. How did you? Orion frowned before he leaned back and straightened. I see. Yes, we'll be there, but we might be late. See you then. He hung up the phone and furrowed his brow as he stared at the screen. Well, I asked him.
That was Mirabelle.
She wants to see us about that premonition she talked about last night, he explained. I raised an eyebrow.
But didn't she tell us she wasn't there?
He nodded.
Yeah.
I tried to tell her we couldn't get there, but she said if we took a certain path through the woods, we'd get to where she would be waiting for us. My eyes widened as my heart skipped a beat. How'd she know where we were? Orion shook his head. I don't know, but we'll find out tonight at midnight. 17. At 11 o'clock that dark night, we crept out of the chicken coop and found the path Mirabelle had told Orion about. We hurried along the winding trail and reached the top of the town with 15 minutes to spare. Below the short hill on which we stood was a small park with a few old teeter-totters and swings. Orion led the way down the last 10 feet of steep slope and onto the greening grass of the park. I sidled up to Orion and lowered my voice to a whisper.
Where's she supposed to meet us?
He nodded at a small, dilapidated shed that stood with its back into the hillside. The front was a metal door of considerable age. In there. I wrinkled my nose.
What's it used for?
Orion shook his head. I don't know. I tried to get into it when I was younger, but the door wouldn't even budge and there's no windows. I pursed my lips.
I hope it's open now.
We strode over, and Orion grabbed the thick handle with a connected lock. He gave a tug and the door gave away with a groan and squeak, but not with trouble. Orion and I glanced at each other. I shrugged. He peeked inside and frowned.
There's a small lit lantern in the corner. At least we're expected, I commented.
Orion glanced over his shoulder at the empty park. We're a little early, so we'll go inside and wait until 10 after midnight. I wrapped my coat tighter around myself.
It can't be any colder than out here.
We stepped inside and Orion closed the door behind us, making sure there was a handle on that end. The bare walls were little comfort against the shadows. The weak oil lamp showed the floor was covered in a thick layer of dust and a few intrusive leaves, but I stumbled over something as I walked into the middle of the 10-foot by 10-foot area. I looked down and frowned. A large sheet of metal covered a square 3 feet of the floor. I kicked at it and walked over to the right wall, which I leaned my back against.
It's not very glamorous being a fugitive from the law, is it?
Orion took a place on the wall beside me and smiled. No. Maybe we should have followed your advice and robbed a bank. I slid down the wall onto my rear and sighed. So, what do you think Mirabelle is going to tell us?
That she foretold you becoming a chosen one?
He joined me on the floor and wrapped an arm around my shoulders. I'll be happy enough if I'm just your chosen one, he teased. I rolled my eyes but couldn't hide a small smile. We can be happy couples in jail, pining away our old age, holding each other's hands through the cell bars.
I'm sure that won't happen.
Our eyes widened. The voice hadn't been either of ours. We whipped our heads toward the door. Before the shut entrance stood the small bent figure of Mirabelle in her simple dress. We scrambled to our feet, and Orion stepped in front of me. Mirabelle chuckled.
There's no need of that.
I'm not going to hurt you. You're a lot quieter than I remember you, Orion commented. Mirabelle stepped around us, causing us to shift closer to the door while she took the back wall. I'm awfully sorry about that. I didn't mean to startle you. Have you heard anything about what happened to us this morning? He asked her. She smiled and nodded.
Yes, and I can say that it's very rude of the police to treat you like that.
You're only trying to help everyone. I arched an eyebrow.
What do you know about what we're trying to do?
She stopped with her back to us and looked at the floor.
Perhaps more than you know.
Through your visions? Orion guessed. Mirabelle paused and half turned to us. The lantern lit up her face and showed her crooked smile.
Not quite, but did you bring my bath salts?
I blinked at her.
You're what?
Mirabelle stood straight, and her short stature seemed to acquire several more inches. My bath salts? The ones I asked you to fetch from the priestess. Gone was the quaint voice of an old woman, and in its place was that of an older man but strong in voice. I blinked, and in that brief moment Mirabelle changed to Troy. There he stood in his normal clothes, and with a playful smile on his lips. I felt Orion stiffen beside me.
What's going on here? He questioned our old acquaintance.
Troy shrugged. Merely a little tete-a-tete, old friend.
How did you conceal your scent? He questioned the old man.
Troy chuckled. A rather easy trick for someone who has lived as long as I have, but parlor tricks isn't why I asked you to meet me here. He knelt down and brushed aside the dust on the floor to reveal the metal sheet with a rusted metal ring in the center. A quick pull revealed a trapdoor, and inside was a ladder that led into a dark passage. Troy looked up and his keen eyes flickered between us.
What I need to show you in through this passage.
I held up my hands.
Wait a sec.
Sage and Mab told us you were missing. I was, but you found me, he replied as he set one foot on one of the lower rungs of the ladder.
But why the secrecy?
Orion asked him. Troy paused in his climb and looked up at us with pursed lips. I will tell you on the other side, now please follow me. Oh, and bring the lantern. It is awfully dark down here, and I do not have the unique ability of your eyesight. He dipped out of sight. I glanced at Orion. He turned to me with a furrowed brow. Well, should we follow him? He wondered. I snorted.
Why ask me?
A hint of a devilish smile slipped onto his lips. You are the CH. I pressed a finger against his lips and glared at him. One word couch, I warned him. He nodded. We'll follow him. Orion went down first, while I grabbed the lantern and handed it to him. The glow illuminated a dirt passage that was tall enough for the men to stand straight, though a few loose roots brushed against the tops of their heads. A few lit lamps hung from the walls and disappeared into the distance ahead of us, as I dropped down into the tunnel, scurrying up a cloud of dust beneath my feet. Troy took the lantern from Orion and turned to face the passage.
Hurry along now.
There is something I wish to show you.
Why did you go into hiding?
Orion asked him, as our guide proceeded down the path. Troy glanced over his shoulder at us. Early this morning, I was resting comfortably in my office when I heard a noise at my window. I kept very still but opened my eyes. I was in time to watch a small plastic tube slide between the sill and window, and into my office. The rest of the crack was filled with rags, and a car was started in the alley. The room was slowly filled with carbon monoxide. Orion pursed his lips. Asphyxiation. Troy nodded before he looked ahead again. Precisely. They pumped the poison into the room for 15 minutes, before the tube was pulled out and the window flung wide open. No doubt to air the room and hide their crime. They left, and I decided I should hide myself for the time being. They? You know who tried to kill you? Orion asked him.
And how'd you hold your breath for that long?
I added. He chuckled. I do, and I didn't, but I will explain everything when we reach our destination. A little faster, if you would. There is much to be said. 18. We hurried along the straight passage for an hour, before I noticed the glimmer of a cluster of lights ahead of us. The ceiling rose up and the tunnel widened, and in another 15 minutes we found ourselves at a dead end. The finish to the tunnel was a round room illuminated by a dozen oil lanterns. Against the wall opposite the tunnel was a mess of thick tree roots that wound their way through one another like brown serpents. Woven among those roots were 4 pedestals of stone, and atop each of them was a single bowl. Inside the bowls was a thick liquid that was ignited, and the flickering flames never ceased as they cast shadows over the roots that surrounded them. Troy hung his lantern on a hook and turned to us with a smile.
Welcome to the world beneath the tree.
I pointed at the roots.
That's the tree.
He nodded.
Yes, but not only the tree.
He swept his arm over the 4 pedestals with their flaming bowls. We stand before a great oath, one that was until a few months ago unbreakable. Orion arched an eyebrow. What oath? Troy dipped his hand into the closest bowl, and came up with a palm full of fire, but the flames didn't burn his skin. The oath that my 3 companions and I swore on this very spot some 200 years ago, that we would be caretakers of this hollow, and all the aspects within it. The book, I spoke up. He smiled.
Yes, the book you discovered at the house of the priestess was a testament to our oath.
We each of us took on the responsibilities that most suited our personalities, and between us we all protected the people of the valley. That is until this, he held the flame up to a clump of roots. The light illuminated a mess of graying roots that, even against the soft light of the flame, appeared to fall to dust. Troy pursed his lips as his eyes flickered over the dead roots. Until the tree was poisoned, and our very lives threatened by these monsters. I took a step forward and held up my hands.
Wait a sec.
What the hell is going on here? How are you still here, after 200 years? Heck, how are you still here after that attempt on your life? Even if you are one of these caretakers, shouldn't you be pushing up daisies? He turned to me and chuckled. I am a caretaker, but you might also say I am something more than my 3 fellow protectors. While they were human once, I never had that privilege. Orion stiffened beside me.
What do you mean?
Troy turned away from us, and slipped the fire back into its bowl. The tree and I are what you would call cousins. We are both creatures of a bygone era when magic was as commonplace as the cold.
Was it as healthy as the cold, too?
I quipped. Troy faced us and leaned his back against the wall of roots.
That has always depended on the wielder.
In the case of we 4 caretakers, the magic has been used to keep the hollow in safety and peace. Unfortunately, he glanced down at the 3 bowls on his right that sat farthest from him, that is beginning to flicker out. Orion and I followed his eyes. I frowned as I beheld the low flames. Are they dying out? Troy nodded.
Yes.
Through sabotage their power has dwindled. If the tree dies it will completely peter out, and so will they. Something to Troy's left caught my eye. I stepped forward and furrowed my brow.
What's that?
A sly smile slipped onto the old man's lips, as his gaze fell on a short pedestal. The stone barely poked out from the roots, and on its top sat a smaller bowl than the others. A tiny flicker of fire burned in the center. That, my dear Miss Lyle, is your bowl. I whipped my head up and blinked at him. Come again. As a prospective caretaker you have your own bowl to show your oath, he explained.
How the hell did that happen?
I snapped. Troy chuckled. Fate and your own persistence. I straightened and shook my head. I'm not 200 years old, and I didn't make any pact with an overgrown bush. He nodded. You are correct on both counts, but you have made a pact. Orion stepped up to me, and set a hand on my shoulder. With who? Troy glanced up at my mate. With you. And your aunt. And Mab and her captain. And the Tercia sisters. And
when the hell did I make a pact with them?
Or even with Orion? I spoke up. When you decided to remain in the Hollow, he told me. You were the first person in its history to be given the chance to leave, but you chose to give yourself to the people of this place. That is why you are the caretaker of everyone who inhabits these lands. My mouth flopped open and shut. I must have looked like a floundering fish.
This just isn't. I looked up at Orion.
His eyes were on Troy and his lips were pursed.
What the hell? What does it mean for Trixie to be a caretaker? He asked the old man.
Troy shrugged. Nothing more than what she has already done. Time and again she has shown a willingness to help others in need, even when her own life is at risk.
But that was just a bunch of stupid stories I was curious about,
I argued. Troy met my eyes with his pale grey ones, and caught me in their calming color. Every life is a story. I lowered my eyes and bit my lower lip. Is this pact why I've been having these headaches? And why everybody's been listening to me? He nodded.
Yes.
By why now and not earlier? Orion asked him. The leaf sage offered to her is what sealed the pact and created the oath, and this, he gestured to the short pedestal with its small bowl. I whipped my head up and my eyebrows crashed down.
So you're saying what? That touching that leaf changed my personality?
He smiled and shook his head. On the contrary, the leaf merely brought out the qualities hidden beneath your rough exterior. I frowned. So you're telling me that I'm all this touchy-feeling type inside? Troy chuckled.
Not exactly that, Miss Lyle.
You have an innate desire to help people. As much can be inferred by your standing here with us, rather than having left the Hollow long ago. I jerked my thumb over my shoulder at Orion. If you were a girl, would you leave that cuter guy behind? He has certainly been invaluable in your adventures, Troy agreed. I ran a hand through my hair and shook my head.
This is unbelievable.
I fear you must have faith, and rather quickly, Troy insisted as he brushed his palm over the flame of one of the less energetic fires. Our foes have been very thorough in their plans. Out of we 4 original caretakers, not a one of us has been spared their cruelty, and the tree has suffered most of all. He looked up at the roots that climbed out of the dirt above our heads. Another few days and it will be past the point where the cure can save it. I leaned toward Troy and frowned. You've known all along who was behind all of this, didn't you? He kept his eyes focused on the flame when he nodded. I did.
So why the hell didn't you tell anybody?
I snapped. Troy dropped his hand to his side and sighed. My innate ability to see into the future was enhanced by the oath, but certain rules prevented me from speaking. Meaning what? I asked him. He stood straight and glanced between us. Meaning that man should not be given his future, but should forge it for himself. My ability would have hampered that growth, so I remained quiet. Can you tell us who it is now? Orion pleaded. Troy's gaze fell on me and he smiled. I believe that is no longer necessary. My eyes widened. You mean it really is the newspaper dynasty? He nodded. I spun around and jabbed a finger into Orion's chest.
I told you it was them.
He held up his hands and smiled. I concede. Just put the finger away. I dropped the finger and turned to Troy.
So we have the culprits, but I'm still not sure why they're doing it.
That is a worthy question to ask after you have captured them, Troy agreed. Orion shook his head. We don't have any proof, and some of the proof we have, like the book, would mean revealing the caretakers for what they are. Troy's eyes fell on me.
What is your plan?
I grinned back at him. How about you tell me what it is and we'll compare notes? He smiled and shook his head. The rules will not. I held up my hand.
I know, no tattling on fate.
Could you at least tell us if we're going to win this battle of the brains? That is also something I cannot say, but for another reason. You see, fate oftentimes shows me two outcomes. Both are decided upon through your own decisions. I threw up my arms. Great. Even fate is giving us the middle finger. Troy chuckled. I doubt even fate would stop you when you have your mind made up. I sighed and looked up at Orion. I have no idea how we're going to get anything done when the whole police force is probably out hunting us right now. He nodded. Ambigo won't stop until he learns what we know. I folded my arms and furrowed my brow as I studied the ground.
What if we told them just enough to get their attention?
You know, led them where we want to lead the lion, witch and wardrobe? Orion arched an eyebrow.
It might work.
Why? I dropped my arms and grinned. Because I have an idea, but we're going to need a snoop, a turkey, and a lot of luck. 19. It was late evening when Orion and I found ourselves in the Tercia barn. The sun was disappearing beneath the horizon as I leaned my back against the door and glanced up at Orion. I know this is a stupid question, but are you sure your aunt spread that rumor? I asked him. He smiled at me. Absolutely. Even if I hadn't told her to call all her friends, she would have done it anyway. And you're sure she didn't change it enough that everybody thinks Abby has a shopping list, and not a list of clients from her sister? I persisted. Orion chuckled.
I had her repeat it to me several times.
She knew what to say.
And she got a hold of Abby. And she was only too glad to help.
I glanced over my shoulder through a crack in the barn door.
Now I only hope everybody else shows up in time for the fun.
Orion smiled as he looked out over the barnyard. If I know him, he'll be here, and with plenty of company. The shadows were disappearing beneath the darkness of night when the lights in the house were turned on. Abby stepped out onto the porch. In her hands was the small book that listed her sister's clients. She clasped it tightly between them as she proceeded down the steps and onto the open driveway. Do you really think they'll come? Orion asked me. I snorted. If that family's really a bunch of news hounds, then they can't resist checking out a good story, especially when they might be implicated in it. Movement made me turn around and peep through the boards. Abby stuffed the notebook into her front apron pocket and strode across the barnyard toward the chicken coop. Her feet crunched upon the gravel, but otherwise all was quiet. Orion stood beside me, peeping through his own hole. He tensed. I opened my mouth to ask, but a slight movement along the gravel caught my attention. It was a small brown mouse, exactly like the one I'd seen the first time we were at the farm. It scampered across the gravel toward Abby. Orion made to move. I grabbed his shoulder.
That's only the scout, I whispered as my eyes swept the skies. We're looking to fry the big bird.
A shadow flew over the clear sky as night settled. Abby paused and looked up. The shadow dove down, its long sharp talons aimed at her throat. She threw up her arm.
Now!
I yelled. Orion and I leapt out of the barn and raised our hands above our heads. We surrender, we shouted in unison. From the shadows came the blinding beams of a dozen flashlights, and nearly as many voices. Police car lights blared on, startling the large vulture. It flapped its powerful wings to gain altitude, but two of the officers leapt at it and grabbed its legs, dragging it down from the air and onto the ground. The bird squawked and thrashed as they pinned its wing to the gravel. 6 of the officers surrounded us, with their weapons drawn. Spotlights from the vehicles landed on us and the thrashing bird. From the shadows outside the circle of light stepped Ambigo and Orso. Ambigo sported a nice black eye that scowled at Orion. I grinned at the pair and gave them a small wave. Hey guys! Did I ever tell you you have great timing? Orso walked up to us, and his eyes flickered between Orion and me. Do you mind telling us what?
You son of a chicken!
This is for Tabby. Abby shouted as she stalked up to the bird and gave it a good kick in the side that made it squawk. Several other officers came up behind her and dragged her away. The vulture partially reverted back to the wrinkled and naked human form of Myrtle Parsons, matriarch of the newspaper dynasty. Her feathers hid the worst parts as she shrank back away from Abby.
She's mad.
Insane. Abby strained against her captors as she tried to get in another kick. How could you do that to her, after everything she did for you? Ha! She helped you for free and you tried to kill her. The officers helped Myrtle up, and she raised her chin in the air as she looked down her nose at Abby.
I have no idea what you're talking about. I'd like to learn what the hell is going on here too, also spoke up.
I raised my hand a little higher. I can explain everything, but first, can I drop my arms? They're getting tired. Also pursed his lips but nodded. Orion and I dropped our arms to our sides, and I nodded at Myrtle. She's your attempted murderer of Tabby, Chief, and the successful murderer of the priestess. Myrtle's face blanched. Nonsense. This is pure nonsense. Also turned to her with a frown.
Then why are you here?
I heard about the rumor that Abby had a notebook and wanted the scoop, she told him. He walked up to her and nodded up at the sky. How do you explain that little dive you took before these two? He jerked his head over his shoulder in our direction, interrupted you.
It's a lie.
A libelous lie, she snapped. Also snorted. You would know about that, but I think all my men would agree that we've got enough suspicion, and, he grabbed one of her taloned hands and raised it to her face, enough evidence to hold you for a few days while we look into things. Ask her where the antidote for the tree is, Orion spoke up. Also half turned to us and arched an eyebrow.
She's involved in that too.
I am not. Myrtle argued. And you might want to get a warrant to search their newspaper office for explosives, Orion added.
It's a lie.
It's all a bunch of lies. Myrtle shrieked.
I think we can take that to print as the truth, I argued.
Her furious eyes fell on me, and she ground her sharp teeth together. Even if your delusions were true, you have no proof against me. Maybe not, but I pointed at the small brown mouse that sat off to one side watching the proceedings. That mouse might. The mouse's ears perked up and its nose ceased to twitch. The little rodent turned tail and ran down toward the house. Also whipped his head toward those of his officers who weren't guarding anyone, and pointed at the retreating rodent. Catch that mouse. Thus began a game that mixed cops and robbers with cat and mouse, as the rodent sent the officers on a merry chase around the barnyard. Myrtle took the chance to use her claws on her own guards and break loose. She was in the air, and mostly transformed when Abby broke from her own officers and flew after her, changing into a large turkey. I didn't realize turkeys could fly that fast, until Abby barreled into the full transformed vulture form of Myrtle. The two birds duked it out in the air, while 4 officers followed them along the ground. Also frowned at the chaos and glanced at Ambigo. Get things under control. Ambigo drew his revolver and pointed the barrel at the scrambling mouse. He fired a single shot ahead of the tiny creature, forcing it to skid to a stop. The pursuing officers lunged and grabbed their prey. One of them grabbed a cage from a cop car, and they stuffed the mouse inside. Ambigo turned his attention on the battling birds. Enough feathers littered the ground that one could stuff a pillow with them. A single shot across the bow, or beaks in this case, forced them apart. He fired again and struck Myrtle in the wing, forcing her to the ground as Abby followed her. I glanced at Ambigo, and my eyes flickered down to his firearm as he stowed it back in its holster. I'm glad we didn't give you a chance to use that earlier. I made sure of that, Orion spoke up. Myrtle half transformed into her human form, and clutched her bleeding arm as she stared daggers at Ambigo. Her old woman demeanor had vanished, and was replaced by a fiery-looking bird creature with dark eyes and a hooked nose. Spittle rained down on the holding officers as she stared daggers at all of us.
You can't do this to me.
I'm the press. I'm the only one who cared about this town. You're just a bunch of blind fools who follow your masters. Also stabbed a finger at one of the cars. Get her in a patrol car. Her furious eyes fell on us as they dragged her away. I'll get you. See that I won't. You ass. You clod. You fool. Any further compliments were stifled, as she was unceremoniously tossed into the back of the vehicle. I shook my head and clucked my tongue. Pity. Orion arched an eyebrow. Why? I turned to him with a grin.
She's a great walking thesaurus.
Also walked up to us and glanced at us both. I expect you two have more proof against her than the show you set up tonight. Orion shook his head.
Not at all, other than Tabby's testimony.
The chief sighed and shook his head.
I should have known better.
Orion swept his eyes over the area.
There might be one more bit of proof.
Loretta Hopper might be somewhere around here with a car and some clothes. Also glanced at a few of the men who surrounded us, and nodded at the fields and woods beyond the barn. Go see what you can find. The men glanced between us and their chief.
He frowned. That's an order.
They saluted, and hurried off into the dark. Also looked at the police car that held Myrtle. The whole vehicle rocked, as she thrashed uselessly in the back. He pursed his lips and shook his head. Who would have guessed she'd be behind the murder? I raised my hand. I did. Also drew off his hat, and ran a hand through his short hair as a chuckle escaped his lips. I suppose only an outsider would have suspected them, but, he slipped his hat back on and turned to us with a smile, I'm glad you did. Besides, I wouldn't have wanted to lock you up for a few months for assaulting an officer. Because of our stunning personalities. I guessed. He nodded at Orion. Because he eats as much as 2 grizzly bears in the fall. Our budget can't handle that kind of strain. The loud roar of a bear caught our attention. It came from the direction of the woods.
Looks like they've got something.
Follow me. Also with Ambigo at our backs led us across the field and into the woods. Another loud roar came to us, but this one was different. It was the roar of a lion. We reached a small clearing, and in the middle was a mess of a fight. Several of the officers were half transformed, their uniforms torn by their thick brown bear fur, as they wrestled with a wildcat who stood in the center. I recognized the long red felt overcoat, but the face was feline with whiskers and a thin mess of fur. The hands ended in sharp claws, and short yellow fur covered her body. Still, it was Hopper who clutched her leather bag and swiped at any officer who dared get close. Ambigo sidled up beside us, and raised his pistol at the wild woman. She whipped her head in our direction, and narrowed her eyes. Her lips curled back and revealed long sharp fangs. You know he's the best shot in the hollow, and won't hesitate to fire if you so much as breathe funny, Hopper, also warned her. Hopper's cat eyes flickered over Orion and me. A smile slipped onto her lips as she raised her clawed hands. The officers leapt at her, and cuffed her arms behind her back. One of them rummaged through her purse, as Ambigo put away his gun.
Sir, there's something here, the officer with the purse spoke up as he walked over to us.
He drew out 2 small vials, one black and one red, and handed them to the chief. Also studied the contents before he glanced at us.
These mean anything to you two.
One might be the poison, and the other the antidote, Orion suggested. Also returned his attention to his captive.
Which one is it, Miss Hopper?
She smiled but said nothing.
He frowned. Well, let me have them, I spoke up.
Also handed me the vials. I stooped over a clump of crabgrass, and poured a drop of each onto a leaf. The black killed the leaf, while the red did nothing. I stood and handed them back.
Does that answer your question?
Also nodded. All too well, and it's the best piece of evidence that'll send them to the far reaches of the hollow for the rest of their lives. I turned my attention to Hopper. I've got a question for you. She snorted. It's the first time in a long time someone's asked me one. Shoot.
Why'd you do it?
Hopper coyly smiled at me. You of all people should know that the news is everything, and sometimes making it is part of the job. Now you're a part of it, also spoke up as he glanced at the holding officers. Take her away. The men marched off with their captured kitty. I stretched my arms over my head and groaned.
Well, now that that's done, I'm ready for a really long nap.
Also looped his arms through one of Orion's and mine, and tugged us in the direction of the farm.
You two are coming too.
I'm going to personally make sure that you get cramps from writing your statements. 20. We were marched back to the cars and driven to the station where, for a painstaking hour, also had us write out everything we were willing to fess up. My hand was definitely cramped by the time I was done. I rubbed my wounded hand as he took my paper. You know this is cruel and unusual punishment, I scolded him.
Can't be helped, he returned as he opened the door to our little quiet statement room.
He nearly bumped into two guests who waited outside, Mab and Sage. Also's eyes flickered to Sage. Well, did that concoction work? Sage smiled and nodded. Very well. The tree will live. She looked past him at us. Would you mind if we spoke with them for a while? You can take them if you want. I've got what I needed, also commented as he held up our statements. He stepped out as they stepped in, and grabbed the handle before he stared at us with narrowed eyes. Don't stay too long. You've caused enough trouble to last a couple of years. With that he shut the door. Sage hurried over to me as I stood and grasped my hands. We can never thank you enough for capturing our enemies and healing the tree. I jerked my head in the direction of Orion. We did it, along with a couple of gossip hounds and Abby. Orion glanced at Mab who stood behind Sage.
How's the rest of the town?
She shrugged, but a smile teased the corners of her lips. A little excited, but I think things will calm down in a few months. I leaned to one side to look behind them.
Where's the librarian?
And Troy? Sage chuckled. The librarian would not leave his library. And Troy finally showed up an hour ago, and the first thing he said was he wanted to speak with you at the place of oaths, wherever the hell that is, Mab told us. I arched an eyebrow as I glanced among the two caretakers. You guys don't know where that is? Sage smiled.
What would our lives be without a little mystery between friends?
I looked to Orion. Ready for one more chore? He smiled and swept his arm toward the door. After you, chosen one. I wrinkled my nose but led the way. Our car had been brought out from the woods and waited for us on the curb. Orion drove us to the park where we got out and walked toward the small filthy building. 10 feet from the door I grabbed his arm and turned him so we faced each other.
I don't know if this is such a good idea.
He frowned.
Why not?
You don't think anyone else helped Hopper and the others? I shook my head.
No, it's just, well, how old are you?
He shrugged.
What does that matter?
My eyes flickered up to him.
I mean, how long does a shift alive?
The same length as a human, why? I averted his curious gaze and bit my lower lip.
It's just, well, 3 of the caretakers are 200 years old, and Troy's probably older than dirt.
That means I'd be left here after you died. I felt tears well up in my eyes, so I squeezed them shut.
I don't think I'd like that.
Orion cupped my chin between his fingers and lifted my gaze to his. There was a smile on his lips as he leaned down and pressed a light kiss to mine. I'm sure you'd be just fine, but you've forgotten one very important thing. I frowned. What? You haven't made the oath yet, he pointed out. My eyes widened before a smile slipped onto my lips.
You know, you might just make a good reporter yet.
He chuckled.
I think I'd stick to hunting.
It's a little less dangerous. I grasped his hand and gave him a tug toward the building.
Come on, Mr. Hunter.
We've got an old man to disappoint. We made our way through the long tunnel and came out in the open room. The flames in the bowls burned high with energy, and many of the grey roots now had a bit of colour to them. Troy stood as he had when we last came to the room, and there was a smile on his lips as he bowed to us. "I must congratulate you on a job well done," he complimented us. I shrugged.
It was nothing.
Just the usual life-threatening danger and mystery. He lifted his eyes to the tree roots and gestured to them. "Are you now prepared to take the oath, and your place as a caretaker?" I wrinkled my nose.
Do I have to take the job?
He lowered his eyes to me, and arched an eyebrow. "You do not wish for the responsibilities?" I shook my head.
It's not that, it's him. I jerked my thumb over my shoulder at Orion.
"A guy like that only comes around once in a lifetime, and if this job comes with an eternity without Orion, I'm out." A smile spread across Troy's lips. He stepped aside and gestured to my bowl, that had been hidden behind him.
"Perhaps this will ease your mind."
Orion and I stepped closer. Inside the bowl was not one flame as I'd previously thought, but two. They intertwined with one another in a soft, warm dance. I blinked at the double flames before I raised my eyes to Troy. "Is that or can we?" He nodded.
"Yes.
"That is, if you take the oath." I narrowed my eyes as I studied the old man.
There won't be any more headaches, right?"
He shook his head.
"None."
"And no sacrifices for this oath?" I persisted. Troy chuckled.
"No."
I slipped my hand into Orion's and stood by his side so that we both faced Troy.
"So, what do we have to do?"
He shook his head.
"Nothing more."
"You have accepted your positions, and that is all the tree needs." He held out his hands to us. "Congratulates, and a hearty welcome to our little group." We shook his hand before I looked up at Orion and smiled.
"What do you say, partner?"
"Ready for a lot of fun." He chuckled. "With you? Always." And we had a lot of fun for a lot of years. A girl couldn't have asked for a better mess of circumstances than when I drove off that mountain highway and into my long and adventurous fate.